Section 21 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. A Legend of Truth. Once upon a time, the ancient legends tell, Truth, rising from the bottom of her well, looked on the world, but hearing how it lied, returned to her seclusion, horrified. There she abode, so conscious of her worth, not even Pilate's question called her forth, nor Galileo kneeling to deny the laws that hold our planet 'neath the sky. Meantime her kindlier sister, whom men call Fiction, did all her work, and more than all, with so much zeal, devotion, tact, and care, that no one noticed Truth was otherwhere. Then came a war, when, bombed and gassed and mined, Truth rose once more, perforce, to meet mankind, and through the dust and glare and wreck of things beheld a phantom on unbalanced wings, reeling and groping, dazed, dishevelled, dumb, but semaphoring direr deeds to come. Truth hailed and bade her stand. The quavering shade clung to her knees and babbled, "Sister, aid! I was thy deputy, and men besought me for my useful tongue or pen to gloss their gentle deeds, and I complied, and they and thy demands were satisfied. But this," she pointed o'er the blistered plain, where men as gods and devils wrought amain, "this is beyond me, take thy work again." Tables and pen transferred, she fled afar, and Truth assumed the record of the war. She saw, she heard, she read, she tried to tell facts beyond precedent and parallel, unfit to hint or breathe, much less to write, but happening every minute, day and night. She called for proof. It came. The dossiers grew. She marked them first. Return. This can't be true. Then, underneath the cold official word, this is not really half of what occurred. She faced herself at last, the story runs, and telegraphed her sister, "Come at once, facts out of hand, unable overtake without your aid, come back for truth's own sake. Co-equal rank and powers, if you agree, they need us both, but you far more than me." End of section 21. Read by Alan Mapstone.
Section 22 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. A friend of the family. There had been rather a long sitting at Lodge, Faith and Works, 5837 EC, that warm April night. 3 initiations and 2 raisings, each conducted with a spaciousness and particularity that our Lodge prides itself upon, made the brethren a little silent, and the strains of certain music had not yet lifted from them. "There are 2 pieces that ought to be barred forever," said a brother as we were sitting down to the banquet. "Last Post is the other." "I can just stand Last Post. It's Tipperary breaks me," another replied, "but I expect everyone carries his own firing irons inside 'em." I turned to look. It was a sponsor for one of our newly raised brethren, a fat man with a fish-like and vacant face, but evidently prosperous. We introduced ourselves as we took our places. His name was Bevan, and he had a chicken farm near Chalfont, St. Giles, whence he supplied, on yearly contract, 2 or 3 high-class London hotels. He was also, he said, on the edge of launching out into herb growing.
"There's a demand for herbs," said he, "but it all depends on your connections with the wholesale dealers. We ain't systematic enough. The French do it much better, especially in the mountains on the Swiss and Italian sides. They use more herbal remedies than we do. Our patent medicine business has killed that with us. But there's a demand still if your connections are sound. I'm going in for it."
A large, well-groomed brother across the table, his name was Pole and he seemed some sort of professional man, struck in with a detailed account of a hollow behind a destroyed village near Thiepval, where for no ascertainable reason a certain rather scarce herb had sprung up by the acre, he said, out of the overturned earth. "And you've got to poke among the weeds to find it, and there's any quantity of bombs and stuff knocking about there still. They haven't cleaned it up yet."
"Last time I saw the place," said Bevan, "I thought it'd be that way till Judgment Day. You know how it lay in that dip under the beet factory? I saw it bombed up level in 2 days, into brick dust mainly. They were hunting for St. Firmin Dump."
He took a sandwich and munched slowly, wiping his face, for the night was close. "Yes," said Pole. "The trouble is there hasn't been any judgment taken or executed. That's why the world is where it is now. We didn't need anything but justice. Afterwards, not getting that, the bottom fell out of things, naturally."
"That's how I look at it too," Bevan replied. "We didn't want all that talk afterwards. We only wanted justice. What I say is, there must be a right and a wrong to things. It can't all be kiss and make friends, no matter what you do."
A thin, dark brother on my left, who had been attending to a cold pork pie — there are no pork pies to equal ours, which are homemade — suddenly lifted his long head, in which a pale blue glass eye swivelled insanely.
"Well," he said slowly, "my motto is, never again. Never again for me."
"Same here till next time," said Pole across the table. "You're from Sydney, ain't you?"
"How do you know?"
was the short answer. "You spoke." The other smiled. So did Bevan, who added,
"I know how you'll push talk well enough. Have you started that republic of yours down under yet?"
"No, but we're going to. Then you'll see."
"Carry on. No one's hindering,"
Bevan pursued. The Australian scowled.
"No, we all know they ain't. And that's what makes us all so crazy angry with you."
He threw back his head and laughed the spleen out of him.
"What can you do with an empire that don't care what you do?" "I've heard that before,"
Bevan laughed, and his fat sides shook. "Oh, I know your push inside out."
"When'd you come across us? My name's Orton. No relation to the Titchborne one." "Glipley, dead mostly. My battalion began there. We only lost half." "Lucky. They gambled us away in 2 days. Remember the hospital on the beach?" asked Orton.
"Yes, and the man without the face, preaching," said Bevan, sitting up a little.
"Till he died,"
said the Australian, his voice lowered.
"And afterwards,"
Bevan added, lower still.
"Christ! Were you there that night?"
Bevan nodded. The Australian choked off something he was going to say as a brother on his left claimed him. I heard them talk horses, while Bevan developed his herb-growing projects with the well-groomed brother opposite. At the end of the banquet, when pipes were drawn, the Australian addressed himself to Bevan across me, and as the company rearranged itself, we three came to anchor in the big anteroom, where the best prints are hung. Here our brother across the table joined us, and moored alongside. The Australian was full of racial grievances, as must be in a young country, alternating between complaints that his people had not been appreciated enough in England, or too fulsomely complimented by an hysterical press. "No," Pole drawled after a while, "you're altogether wrong. We hadn't time to notice anything. We're all too busy fighting for our lives. What your crowd down under are suffering from is growing pains. You'll get over 'em in 300 years or so, if you're allowed to last so long."
"Who's going to stoush us?"
Orton asked fiercely. This turned the talk again to larger issues and possibilities, delivered on both sides straight from the shoulder without malice or heat, between bursts of song from round the piano at the far end. Bevan and I sat out, watching.
"Well, I don't understand these matters," said Bevan at last, "but I'd hate to have one of your crowd have it in for me for anything." "Would you? Why?"
Orton pierced him with his pale, artificial eye.
"Well, you're a trifle,
what's the word?
Vindictive. Spiteful. At least that's what I've found.
I expect it comes from drinking stewed tea with your meat 4 times a day," said Bevan.
"No, I'd hate to have an Australian after me for anything in particular."
Out of this came his tale, somewhat in this shape. It opened with an Australian of the name of Hickmott or Hickmer, Bevan called him both, who, finding his battalion completely expended at Gallipoli, had joined up with what stood of Bevan's battalion, and there remained unrebuked and unnoticed. The point that Bevan laboured was that this man had never seen a tablecloth, a china plate, or a dozen white people together till, in his 30th year, he had walked for 2 months to Brisbane to join up. Poll found this hard to believe.
"But it's true,"
Bevan insisted.
"This chap was born and bred among the blackfellas, as they call 'em, 200 miles from the nearest town, 400 miles from a railway, and 10,000 from the grace of God out in Queensland near some desert." "Why, of course. We come out of everywhere," said Orton. "What's wrong with that?" "Yes, but, look here. From the time that this man Hickmott was 12 years old, he'd conducted sheep for his father for thousands of miles on end, and months at a time, alone with these blackfellas that you daren't show the back of your neck to, else they knock your head in. That was all that he'd ever done till he joined up. He didn't belong to anything in the world, you understand. He didn't strike other men as being a human being. Why, he was a Queensland drover. They're all right," Orton explained. "I dare say, but, well, a man notices another man, don't he? You'd notice if there was a man standing or sitting or lying near you, wouldn't you? So'd anyone. But you'd never notice Hickmott. His being anywhere about wouldn't stand your mind. He just didn't draw attention any more than anything else that happened to be about. Have you got it?"
"Wasn't any use at his job?" Poll inquired.
"I've nothing against him that way, and I was his platoon sergeant. He wouldn't volunteer specially for any doings, but he'd slip out with the party and he'd slip back with what was left of him. No one noticed him, and he never opened his mouth about any doings. You'd think a man who lived the way he lived among blackfellas and sheep would be noticeable enough in an English battalion, wouldn't you?" "It teaches them to lie close, but you seem to have noticed him," Orton interposed with a little suspicion. "Not at the time, but afterwards. If he was noticeable, it was on account of his unnoticeability. Same way you'd notice there not being an extra step at the bottom of the staircase when you thought there was." "Yes," Poll said suddenly. "The eternal mystery of personality. God before whom ever lie bare. Some people can occlude their personality like turning off a tap. I beg your pardon. Carry on." "Granted," said Bevan. "I think I catch your drift. I used to think I was a student of human nature before I joined up." "What was your job before?" Orton asked. "Oh, I was the young blood of the village. Goalkeeper in our soccer team, secretary of the local cricket and rifle, clubs. Yes, and village theatricals. My father was the chemist in the village. How I did talk. What I did know." He beamed upon us all. "I don't mind hearing you talk," said Orton, lying back in his chair. "You're a little different from some of them. What happened to this damn drover of yours?" "He was with our push for the rest of the war, and I don't think he ever sprung a dozen words at one time. With his upbringing, you see, There wasn't any subject that any man knew about he could open up on. He kept quiet, mixed with his backgrounds. If there was a lump of dirt, or a hole in the ground, or what was left after anything had happened, it would be Hickmott. That was all he wanted to be. A camouflager, Orton suggested. You have it. He was the complete camouflager all through. That's him to a dot. Look here. He hadn't even a nickname in his platoon. Then a friend of mine from our village, of the name of Viggers, came out with a draft. Bert Viggers. As a matter of fact, I was engaged to his sister, and Bert hadn't been with us a week before they called him the Grief. His father was an oldish man, a market gardener, high-class vegetables, bit of glass, and all the rest of it. Do you know anything about that particular business? Not much, I'm afraid, said Poll, except that glass is expensive and that one's man always sells the cut flowers. Then you do know something about it. It is. Bert was the old man's only son, and I don't blame him. He'd done his damnedest to get exempted, for the sake of the business, you understand. But he caught it all right. The tribunal wasn't taking any the day he went up. Bert was for it, with a few remarks from the patriotic old wassers on the bench. Our county paper had 'em all. That's the thing that made one really want their Hun in England for a week or two, said Poll. I see. The same tribunal, having copped Bert, gave unconditional exemption to the opposition shop, a man called Margetts in the market garden business, which he'd established since the war with his 2 sons, who everyone in the village knew had been pushed into the business to save their damned hides. But Margetts had a good lawyer to advise him. The whole case was frank and above board to a degree. Our county paper had it all in too. Agricultural produce, vital necessity, the plough mightier than the sword, and those ducks on the bench who had turned down Bert nodding and smiling at Margetts, all full of his cabbage and green peas. What happened? The usual. Viggers' business, he's 68 with asthma, goes smash, and Margetts and co. double theirs. So then, that was Bert's grievance, and he joined us full of it. That's why they called him the Grief. Knowing the facts, I was with him. But being a sergeant, I had to check him, because grievances are catching, and 3 or 4 men with him make companies a sticky. Luckily, Bert wasn't handy with his pen. He had to cork up his grievance mostly till he came across Hickmott, and God in heaven knows what brought those 2 together. No. As you were. I'm wrong about God. Always am. It was sheep. Bert knew as much about sheep as I do, and that's Canterbury lamb. But he'd let Hickmott talk about him for hours in return for Hickmott listening to his grievance. Hickmott'd talk sheep, the one created thing he'd ever open up on, and Bert'd talk his grievance while they was waiting to go over the top. I've heard him again and again, and of course I encouraged him. Now look here, Hickmott hadn't seen an English house or a field or a road or anything any civilised man is used to in all his life. Sheep and blacks, market gardens and glass and exemption tribunals, and the men's teeth chatting behind their masks between rum issue and zero. Oh, there was fun in hell those days, wasn't there, boys? Sure. Oh, sure. Orton chuckled, and Poll echoed him. Look here, when we were lying up somewhere among the forsaken chicken camps back at Dullins, I found Hickmott making mud pies in a farmyard and Bert looking on. He'd made a model of our village according to Bert's description of it. He'd preserved it in his head through all these weeks and weeks of Bert's yap, and he'd coughed it all up. Marget's house and gardens, old Mr. Viggers' ditto, both pubs, my father's shop, everything that he'd been told by Bert done out to scale in mud, with bits of brick and stick. Haig ought to have seen it, but as his sergeant, I had to check him for misusing his winkle pin on dirt. Come to think of it, a man who runs about uninhabited countries with sheep for a living must have gifts for mapping and scaling things somehow or other, or he'd be dead. I never saw anything like it. All out of what Bert had told him by word of mouth. The next time we went up the line, Hickmott copped it in the leg just in front of me. Finish? I asked. Oh no, only beginning. That was in December, something or other, 16. In January, Viggers copped it for keeps. I buried him. Snowing blind it was. Before we got him under, the whole show was crumped. They wanted to bury him again just to spite him. I'm a spiteful man by nature. But the party wasn't taken any more, even if they could have found it. But you see, we had buried him all right, which is what they wanted home. And I wrote the usual trimmings about the chaplain of the full service and what his captain had said about Bert being recommended for a pip, and the irreparable loss, and so on. That was in January 17. In February, sometime or other, I got saved. My specialty had come to be bombings and night doings. Very pleasant for a young free man, but there's a limit to what you can stand. Takes all men differently. Noise was what started me at last. I'd just got up to the edge, wondering when I'd crack and how many of our men I'd do in if it came on me while we were busy. Had that nice taste in the mouth and the nice temperature they call trench fever, and I had to feel inside my head for the meaning of every order I gave or was responsible for executing. You know?
We do. Go on, said Pole in a tone that made Orton look at him.
So you see, the betting was even on my drawing of EC or getting a number umpty rest camp or the firing party before breakfast. But Gord saved me. I made friends with him the last 2 years of the war. The others went off too quick. They wanted a bombing instructor for the training battalion at home, and he put it into their silly hearts to indent for me. It took 'em 5 minutes to make me understand I was saved. Then I vomited, then I cried. You know. The fat face of Bevan had changed, and had grown drawn, even as he spoke, and his hands tugged as though to tighten an imaginary belt.
I was never keen on bombing myself, said Pole, but bombing instruction's murder.
I don't deny it's a shade risky, especially when they take the pin out and start shaking it, same as the Chinks used to do in the woods at Beauty when they were cutting them down. But you live like a home defence brigadier besides weekend leave. As a matter of fact, I married Bert's sister as soon as I could after I got the billet, and I used to lie in our bed thinking of the old crowd on the Somme and feeling what a swine I was. Of course, I earned 2 VCs a week behind the traverse and the exercise of my ordinary duties, but that isn't the same thing. And yet, I'd only joined up because I couldn't damn well help it. And what about your Queenslander? The Australian asked. Too sweet. Pronto. We got a letter in May from a Brighton hospital matron saying that one of them, name of Hickmer, was anxious for news of me, previous to proceeding to Roehampton for initiation into his new leg. Of course, we applied for him by return. Bert had written about him to his sister, my missus, every time he wrote at all. And any pal of Bert's, well, you know what the ladies are like. I warned her about his peculiarities. She wouldn't believe till she saw him. He was just the same. You'd have thought he'd show up in England like a fresh stiff on snow. But you'd never noticed him. You never heard him, and if he didn't want to be seen, he wasn't there. He just joined up with his background. I knew he could do that with men. But how in hell, seeing how curious women are, he could camouflage with the ladies. My wife and my mother to wit. Beats me. He'd feed the chickens for us. He'd stand on his one leg, it was off above the knee, and saw wood for us. He'd run, he'd hop, errands for Mrs. B or mother. Our dog worshipped him from the start, though I never saw him throw a word to him. And yet he didn't take any place anywhere. You've seen a rabbit, you've seen a pheasant hiding in a ditch. Put your hand on it sometimes before it moved, haven't you? Well, that was Hickmott, with 2 women in the house, crazy to find out anything about him that made him human. You know what women are. He stayed with us a fortnight, left us on a Saturday to go to Roehampton to try his leg. On Friday he came over to the bombing ground, not saying anything as usual, to watch me instruct my suicide club, which was only half an hour's run by rail from our village. He had his overcoat on, and as soon as he reached the place, it was ma fiche with him as usual. Rabbit trick again. You never noticed him. He sat in the bomb-proof behind the pit where the duds accumulate till it's time to explode 'em. And naturally that's strictly forbidden to the public, so we went there, and no one noticed him. When he'd had enough of watching, he hopped off home to feed our chickens for the last time. Then how do you know all about it? Orton said. Because I saw him come into the place just as I was going down into the trench. Then he slipped my memory till my train went back. But it would have made no difference what our arrangements were. If Hickmer didn't choose to be noticed, he wasn't noticed. Just for curiosity's sake, I asked some of the staff sergeants whether they'd seen him on the ground. Not one. Not one single one had, or could tell me what he was like. And Saturday noon, he went off to Roehampton. We saw him into the train ourselves, the lunch Mrs. B had put up for him, a one-legged man in his crutch, in regulation blue, khaki, warm, and kit bag. Taken everything together, perhaps he'd spoken as many as 20 times in the 13 days he'd been with us. I'm giving you it straight as it happened. And now, look here. This is what did happen. Between 2 and 3 that Sunday morning, dark and blowing from the north, I was woke up by an explosion and people shouting, "Raid!" The first bang fetched them out like worms after rain. There was another some minutes afterwards, and me and a sergeant in the Shropshires on leave told 'em all to take cover. They did. There was a devil of a long waiting, and there was a third pop. Everyone, including me, heard aeroplanes. I didn't notice till afterwards that... Bevan paused. "What?" said Orton. "Oh, I noticed a heap of things afterwards. What we noticed first, the Shropshire sergeant and me, was a rick well alight back in Margette's house, and with that north wind blowing straight onto another rick of Margette's. It went up all of a whoosh. The next thing we saw by the light of it was Margette's house with a bomb hole in the roof, and rafters leaning sideways like they always lean on such occasions. So we ran there, and the first thing we met was Margette's in a split-tailed nightie calling on his mother and damning his wife. A man always does that when he's cross. Have you noticed? Mrs. Margette's was in a nightie too, reminding Margette's that he hadn't completed his rick insurance, and that's a woman's love and care all over. Behind them was their eldest son in trousers and slippers, nursing his arm and calling for the doctor. They went through us howling like Flammenwerfer casualties, right up the street to the surgery. Well, there wasn't anything to do except let the show burn out. We hadn't any means of extinguishing conflagrations. Some of them fiddled with buckets, and some of them tried to get out some of Margette's sticks, but his younger son kept shouting, Don't! It'll be stole! It'll be stole!" So it burned instead, till the roof came down top of all. A little cheap, dirty villa. In real life, one whiz-bang would have shifted it. But in our civil village, it looked that damned important particularly you wouldn't believe. We couldn't get round to Margette's stable because of the 2 ricks alight, but we found somewhere that opened the door early, and the horses was in Margette's new vegetable piece down the hill, which he'd hired off old Viggers to extend his business with. I loved the way a horse always looks after his own belly, same as a gunner. They went to grazing down the carrots and onions till young Margette's ran to turn 'em out, and then they got in among the glass frames and cut themselves. We had a regular Russian night of it, everyone giving advice and falling over each other. When it got light, we saw the damage. House, 2 ricks, and stable my fish. The big glass house with every pane smashed and the furnace end of it blown clean out. All the horses and about 15 head of cattle. Butcher's stalls from the next field, feeding in the new vegetable piece. It was a fair clean-up from end to end. House, furniture, fittings, plant, and all the early crops. "Was there any other damage in the village?" I asked. "I'm coming to it. The curious part. But I wouldn't call it damage. I was renting a field then for my chickens off the Merecroft estate. It's accommodation land, and there was a wet ditch at the bottom that I wanted forever so long to dam up to make a swim-hole for Mrs. Bevan's ducks." "Ah," said Orton, half turning in his chair all in one piece. Suppose I was allowed? Not me. Their agent came down on me for tampering with the estate's draining arrangements, and all I wanted was to bring the bank down where the ditch narrows. A couple of cartloads of dirt would have held the water back for 6 yards, no more than that, and I could have made a little spillway over the top with 3 boards, same as in the trenches. Well, the first bomb, the one that woke me up, had done my work for me better than I could. It had dropped just under the hollow of the bank and brought it all down in a fair landslide. I got my swim hole for Mrs. Bevan's ducks, and I didn't see how the estate could kick at the act of God, do you? "And Hickmott?"
said Orton, grinning.
Hold on. There was a parish council meeting to demand reprisals, of course. There was the policeman and me poking about the ruins till the explosive expert came down in his motor car at 3 p.m. Monday. And he meets all the Margettes off their rockers, howling in the surgery, and he sees my swim hole filling up to the brim.
What did he say? Paul inquired.
He sized it up at once. He had to get back to dine in town that evening. He said all the evidence proved that it was a lucky shot on the part of one isolated Hun plane going home, and we weren't to take it to heart. I don't know that anybody but the Margettes did. He said they must have used incendiary bombs of a new type, which he'd suspected for a long time. I don't think the man was any worse than God intended him to be. I don't really. But the Shropshire sergeant said...
And what did you think? I interrupted.
I didn't think. I knew by then. I'm not a Sherlock Holmes, but having chucked him and chucked him back and kicked him out of the light and slept with him for 2 years and making my living out of them at that time, I could recognise the fuse of a Mills bomb when I found it. I found all 3 of them. Curious about that second in Margette's glass house. Hickmott must have raked the ashes out of the furnace, popped it in and shut the furnace door. He'd operated all right. Not one living pane left in the putty, and all the brickwork spread around the yard in streaks, just like that St. Firmin village we were talking about.
But how do you account for young what's-his-name getting his arm broken? Said Paul.
Crutch, said Bevan. If you or me had taken on that night's doings with one leg, we'd have hopped and sweated from one flank to another and been caught halfway between. Hickmott didn't. I'm as sure as I'm sitting here that he did his doings quiet and comfortable at his full height. He was over 6 feet, and no one noticed him. This is the way I see it. He fixed the swim hole for Mrs. Bevan's ducks first. We used to talk over our own affairs in front of him, of course, and he knew just what she wanted in the way of a pond. So he went and made it at his leisure. Then he probably went over to the Margettes and lit the first rick, knowing that the wind would do the rest. When young Margettes saw the light of it and came out to look, Hickmott would have taken post at the back door and dropped the young swine with his crutch, same as we used to drop Huns coming out of a dugout. You know how they blink at the light. Then he must have walked off and opened Margette's stable door to save the horses. There'd be more to him than any man's life. Then he probably chucked one bomb on top of Margette's roof, having seen that the first wreck had caught the second and the whole house was bound to go. Do you get me? Then why did he waste his bomb on the house? Said Orton. His glass eyes seemed as triumphant as his real one. For camouflage, of course. He was camouflaging an air raid. When the Margettes piled out of their place into the street, he probably attended to the glass house, because that would be Margette's chief means of business. After that, I think so, because otherwise I don't see where all those extra cattle came from that we found in the vegetable piece. He must have walked off and rounded up all the butcher's beasts in the next meadow and driven 'em there to help the horses. When he'd finished everything he set out to do, I'll lay my life in kit, he curled up like a bloomin' wombat not 50 yards away from the whole flaming show and let us run around him. And when he'd had his sleep out, he went up to Roehampton Monday morning, by some train that he decided upon in his own mind weeks and weeks before.
Did he know all the trains then? Said Paul.
Ask me another. I only know that if he wanted to get from any place to another without being noticed, he did it.
And the bombs? He got 'em from you, of course, Paul went on.
What do you think? He was an hour in the park watching me instruct, sitting, as I remember, in the bomb-proof by the dart-hole in his overcoat. He got 'em all right. He took neither more nor less than he wanted. And I've told you what he did with them. 1, 2, and 3. Ever see him afterwards? Said Orton. Yes. Saw him at Brighton when I went down there with the missus not a month after it had been broken into his Roehampton leg. You know how the boys used to sit all along Brighton front in their blues and jump every time the coal was being delivered to the hotels behind him? I barged into him opposite the old ship, and I told him about our air raid. I told him how Margette's had gone off his rocker and walked around staring at the sky and holding reprisal meetings all by himself, and how old Mr. Vickers had brought in what he'd left. Though, of course, I said what was left of Margette's business, and how well my swim hole for the ducks was doing. It didn't interest him. Didn't want to come over to stay with us any more either. We were a long, long way back in his past. You can see that. He wanted to get back with his new leg to his own God-forsaken sheep walk and his black fellas in Queensland. I expect he's done it now and no one has noticed him. But by Gord, he did leak a little at the end. He did that much. While we was waiting for the tram to the station, I said how grateful I was to Fritz for mopping up Margette's and making our swim all and all in one night. Mrs. B seconded the motion. We couldn't have done less. Well then, Hickmott, speaking in his queer way as if English words was all new to him. "Ah, go and bail up in hell," he says. "Bert was my friend." That was all. I've given it to you just as it happened, word for word. I'd hate to have an Australian have it in for me for anything I'd done to his friend. Mark you, I don't say there's anything wrong with you Australians, Brother Orton. I only say they ain't like us, or anyone else that I know. "Well, what do you want us to be?" said Orton. No. It takes all sorts to make a world, as the saying is. And now, Bevan pulled out his gold watch. If I don't make a move at it, I'll miss my last train. "Let her go," said Orton serenely. "You've done some lorry hopping in your time, haven't you, Sergeant?" "When I was 2.5 stone lighter, digger," Bevan smiled in reply. "Well, I'll run you out home before sun-up. I'm a haulage contractor now. London and Oxford. There's an empty of mine ordered to Oxford. We can go round by your place as easy as not. She's lying out Vauxhall way. By God, and see the sun rise again. Haven't seen him since I can't remember when," said Bevan, chuckling. "Oh, there was fun sometimes in hell, wasn't there, Australia?" And again his hands went down to tighten the belt that was missing. End of section 22.
Section 23 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. We and they. Father, mother and me, sister and auntie say, all the people like us are we, and everyone else is they. And they live over the sea, while we live over the way. But, would you believe it, they look upon we as only a sort of they. We eat pork and beef with cow horn-handled knives. They who gobble their rice off a leaf are horrified out of their lives, and they who live up a tree and feast on grubs and clay, isn't it scandalous, look upon we as a simply disgusting they. We shoot birds with a gun, they stick lions with spears. Their full dress is on, we dress up to our ears. They like their friends for tea, we like our friends to stay. And, after all that, they look upon we as an utterly ignorant they. We eat kitcheny food, we have doors that latch. They drink milk or blood under an open thatch. We have doctors to fee, they have wizards to pay. And, impudent heathen, they look upon we as a quite impossible they. All good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us are we, and everyone else is they. And if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, you may end up by, think of it, looking on we as only a sort of they. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. read by Beeswaxcandle. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. On the Gate. A Tale of 16. If the order above be but the reflection of the order below, as that ancient affirms who had some knowledge of the order, it is not outside the order of things that there should have been confusion also in the department of death. The world's steadily falling death rate, the rising proportion of scientifically prolonged fatal illnesses, which allowed months of warning to all concerned, had weakened initiative throughout the necrological departments. When the war came, these were as unprepared as civilized mankind, and like mankind they improvised and recriminated in the face of heaven. As Death himself observed to St. Peter, who had just come off the gate for a rest, "One does the best one can with the means at one's disposal, but—" "I know," said the good saint sympathetically. "Even with what help I can muster, I'm on the gate 22 hours out of the 24. Do you find your volunteer staff any real use?" Death went on. "Isn't it easier to do the work oneself, then?" "One must guard against that point of view," St. Peter returned. "But I know what you mean. Office officialises the best of us." "What is it now?" He turned to a prim-lipped seraph who had followed him with an expulsion form for signature. St. Peter glanced it over. "Private R.M. Buckland," he read, "on the charge of saying that there is no God. That all?" "He says he's prepared to prove it, sir, and, according to the rules—" "If you will make yourself acquainted with the rules, you'll find they lay down that the fool says in his heart there is no God. That decides it. Probably shell shock. Have you tested his reflexes?" "No, sir. He kept on saying that there—" "Pass him in at once. Tell off someone to argue with him and give him the best of the argument till St. Luke's free. Anything else?" "A hospital nurse's record, sir. She's been nursing for 2 years. "A long while," St. Peter spoke severely. "She may very well have grown careless." "It's her civilian record, sir. I judge best to refer it to you." The seraph handed him a vivid scarlet docket. "Next time," said St. Peter, folding it down and writing on one corner, "that you get one of these tinted forms, mark it QMA and pass bearer at once. Don't worry over trifles." The seraph flashed off and returned to the clamorous gate. "Which department is QMA?" said Death. St. Peter chuckled. "It's not a department, it's a ruling. Quia multum amavit. A most useful ruling. I've stretched it to... Now I wonder what that child actually did die of." "I'll ask," said Death, and moved to a public telephone nearby. "Give me war check and audit. English side, non-combatant," he began. "Latest returns. Surely you've got them posted up to date by now?" "Yes, hospital nurse in France." "No, not nature and aliases. I said, what was nature of illness?" "Thanks." He turned to St. Peter. "Quite normal," he said. "Heart failure after neglected pleurisy following overwork." "Good." St. Peter rubbed his hands. "That brings her under the high allowance, GLH scale, greater love hath no man. But my people ought to have known that from the first." "Who is that clerk of yours?" said Death. "He seems rather a stickler for the proprieties." "The usual type nowadays," St. Peter returned. "A young power in charge of some half-baked universe. Never having dealt with life yet, he's somewhat nebulous." Death sighed. "It's the same with my old department heads. Nothing on earth will make my fossils on the normal civil side realise that we're dying in a new age. Come look at them. They might interest you." "Thanks. I will. But, excuse me a minute. It's my zealous young assistant on the wing once more." The Seraph had returned to report the arrival of overwhelmingly heavy convoys at the gate, to ask what the saint advised. "I'm just off on an interdepartmental inspection. 'Twill take me some time," said St. Peter. "You must learn to act on your own initiative. So I shall leave you to yourself for the next hour or two, merely suggesting, I don't wish in any way to sway your judgment, that you invite St. Paul, St. Ignatius, Loyola, I mean, and St. Christopher to assist as supervising assessors on the Board of Admission. Ignatius is one of the subtlest intellects we have, and an officer and gentleman to boot. I assure you," the saint turned towards Death, "he revels in dialectics. If he's allowed to prove his case, he's quite capable of letting off the offender. St. Christopher, of course, will pass anything that looks wet and muddy." "They're nearly all that now, sir," said the Seraph. "So much the better. And, as I was going to say, St. Paul is a distinctly strong colleague. Still, we all have our weaknesses. Perhaps a well-timed reference to his seamanship in the Mediterranean. By the way, look up the name of his ship, will you? Alexandria Register, I think. Might be useful in some of those sudden maritime cases that crop up. I didn't tell you to be firm, of course. That's your besetting. Reprimand him severely and publicly. But," the saint's voice broke, "oh, my child, you don't know what it is to need forgiveness. Be gentle with him. Be very gentle with him." Swiftly as a falling shaft of light, the Seraph kissed the sandalled feet and was away. Said St. Peter, "you can't go far wrong with that Board of Admission as I've arranged it." They walked towards the great central office of normal civil death, which, buried to the knees in a flood of temporary structures, resembled a closed cribbage board among spilt dominoes. They entered an area of avenues and cross-avenues, flanked by long, low buildings, each packed with seraphs working wing to folded wing. "Oh, temporary buildings," Death explained, "always being added to. This is the war side. You'll find nothing changed to the normal civil side. They're more human than mankind." "It doesn't lie in my mouth to blame them," said St. Peter. "No, I've yet to meet the soul you wouldn't find excuse for," said Death tenderly. "But then I don't arrange my boards of admission. If one doesn't help one's staff will never help itself," St. Peter laughed as the shadow of the main porch of the normal civil death offices darkened above them. "This facade rather recalls the Vatican, doesn't it?" said the saint. "Quite as conservative. Notice how they still keep the old Holbein uniforms. Morning, Sergeant Fell. How goes it?" said Death as he swung the dusty doors and nodded at a commissionaire clad in the grim livery of death, even as Hans Holbein had designed it. "Sadly, very sadly indeed, sir," the commissionaire replied. "So many poor ladies and gentlemen, sir, who might well have lived another few years, going off, as you might say, in every direction, with no time for the proper obsequies." "Too bad," said Death sympathetically. "Well, we're none of us as young as we were, Sergeant." They climbed a carved staircase, behung with the whole millinery of undertaking at large. Death halted on a dark Aberdeen granite landing and beckoned a messenger. "We're rather busy today, sir," the messenger whispered, "but I think His Majesty will see you." "Who is the head of this department if it isn't you?" St. Peter whispered in return. "You may well ask," his companion replied. "I'm only—" He checked himself and went on. "The fact is, our normal civil death side is controlled by a being who considers himself all that I am and more. He's death as men have made him, in their own image." He pointed to a brazen plate by the side of a black curtained door, which read, "Normal civil death, KG, KT, KP, PC, etc. He's as human as mankind. I guessed as much from those letters. What do they mean? Titles conferred on him from time to time. King of Ghosts, King of Terrors, King of Phantoms, Pallid Conqueror, and so forth. There's no denying he's earned every one of them. First-class mind. Just a little bit of a...
His Majesty is at liberty,
said the messenger. Civil death did not belie his name. No monarch on earth could have welcomed them more graciously, or in St. Peter's case, with more of that particularity of remembrance which is the gift of good kings. But when Death asked him how his office was working, he became at once the departmental head with a grievance. "Thanks to this abominable war," he began testily, "my NCD has to spend all its time fighting for mere existence. Your new war side seems to think that nothing matters except the war. I've been asked to give up 2/3 of my archives basement, E7 to E64, to the Polish civilian casualty check and audit. Preposterous! Where am I to move my archives? And they've just been cross-indexed too." "As I understand it," said Death, "our war side merely applied for desk room in your basement. They were prepared to leave your archives in situ." "Impossible! We may need to refer to them at any moment. There's a case now which is interesting us all. Mrs. Ollerby, Worcestershire by extraction, dying of an internal hereditary complaint. At any moment we may wish to refer to her dossier. And how can we if our basement is given up to people over whom we exercise no departmental control? This war has been made an excuse for slackness in every direction." "Indeed," said Death, "you surprise me. I thought nothing made any difference to the NCD." "A few years ago I should have concurred," Death replied. "But since this recent outbreak of unregulated mortality, there has been a distinct lack of respect towards certain aspects of our administration. The attitude is bound to reflect itself in the office. The official is, in a large measure, what the public makes him. Of course, it is only temporary reaction, but the merest outsider would notice what I mean. Perhaps you would like to see for yourself." Civil Death bowed towards St. Peter, who feared that he might be taking up his time. "Not in the least. If I am not the servant of the public, what am I?" Civil Death said, and preceded them to the landing. "Now this," he ushered them into an immense but badly lighted office, "is our International Mortuary Department, the IMD, as we call it. It works with the check and audit. I should be sorry to say offhand how many billions sterling it represents invested in the funeral ceremonies of all the races of mankind." He stopped behind a very bald-headed clerk at a desk. "And yet we take cognizance of the minutest detail, do not we?" he went on. "What have we here, for example?"
"Funeral expenses of the late Mr. John Shanks, tanner." The clerk stepped aside from the red-ruled book. "Cut down by the executors on account of the war from £173 19 1 to £47 for 18 4. A sad falling off, if I may say so, Your Majesty." "And what was the attitude of the survivors?" Civil Death asked. "Very casual. It was a motor hearse funeral." "A pernicious example spreading, I fear, even in the lowest classes," his superior muttered. "Haste, lack of respect for the dread summons, carelessness in the subsequent disposition of the corpse, and—" "But as regards people's real feelings?" St. Peter demanded of the clerk. "That isn't within the terms of our reference, sir," was the answer. "But we do know that as often as not they don't even buy black-edged announcements cards these days." "Good heavens!" said Civil Death swellingly. "No cards? I must look into this myself. Forgive me, St. Peter, but we servants of humanity, as you know, are not our own masters. No cards, indeed." He waved them off with an official hand, and immersed himself in the ledger. "Oh, come along," Death whispered to St. Peter. "This is a blessed relief." They two walked on till they reached the far end of the vast dim office.
The clerks at the desks here scarcely pretended to work. A messenger entered and slapped down a small autophonic reel. "Here you are," he cried. "Mr. Wilbraham Latimer's last dying speech and record. He made a shocking end of it." "Good for Latimer," a young voice called from a desk. "Chuck it over." "Yes," the messenger went on. "Latimer said to his brother, 'Bert, I haven't time to worry about a little thing like dying these days, and what's more important, you haven't either. You go back to your solemn doings, and I'll put it through with Aunt Maria. It'll amuse her, and it won't hinder you.' That's nice stuff for your boss." The messenger whistled and departed. The clerk groaned as he snatched up the reel. "How the deuce am I to knock this into official shape?" he began. "Pass us the edifying gantry, Tubnall. I'll have to crib from him again, I suppose." "Be careful," a companion whispered and shuffled a typewritten form along the desk. "I've used Tubby twice this morning already." The late Mr. Gantry Tubnall must have demised on approved departmental lines, for his record was much thumbed. Death and St. Peter watched the editing with interest. "I can't bring in Aunt Maria anyway," the clerk broke out at last. "Listen here, everyone, she has heart disease. She dies just as she's lifted the dropsical Latimer to change his sheets. She says, 'Sorry, Willie, I'd make a damn poor hospital nurse.' Then she sits down and croaks. Now I call that good. I've a great mind to take it round to the warside as an indirect casualty and get a breath of fresh air." "Then you'll be hauled over the coals," the neighbour suggested. "I'm used to that too," this clerk sniggered. "Are you?" said Death, stepping forward suddenly from behind a high map stand. "Who are you?" The clerk scoured in his skeleton jacket. I'm not on the regular establishment, sir," he stammered. "I'm a volunteer. I wanted to see how people behaved when they was in trouble." "Did you? Well, take the late Mr. Wilbraham Latimer's and Miss Maria Latimer's papers to the Warside General Reference Office. When they have been passed upon, tell the attendance clerk that you were to serve as probationer in, in the domestic-induced casualty side, 7GS. The clerk collected himself a little and spoke through dry lips. But I slipped in from the lower establishment, sir," he breathed. There was no need to explain. He shook from head to foot as with the palsy. And under all heaven none tremble save those who come from that class which also believe and tremble. "You tell me this officially, or as one created being to another?" Death asked after a pause. Non-officially, sir. Strictly non-officially, as long as you know all about it." His awe-stricken fellow workers could not restrain a smile at Death having to be told about anything. Even Death bit his lips. "I don't think you'll find the Warside will raise any objection," said he. "By the way, they don't wear that uniform over there." Almost before Death ceased speaking, it was ripped off and flung on the floor, and that which had been a sober clerk of normal civil death stood up, an unmistakable, curly-haired, bat-winged, fawn-eared imp of the pit. But where his wings joined his shoulders, there was a patch of delicate dove-coloured feathering that gave promise to spread all up the pinion. St. Peter saw it and smiled, for it was a known sign of grace. "Thank goodness!" the ex-clerk gasped as he snatched up the Latimer records and sheared sideways through the skylight. "Amen," said Death and St. Peter together, and walked through the door. "Weren't you hinting something to me a little while ago about my lax methods?" St. Peter demanded innocently. "Well, if one doesn't help one's staff will never help itself," Death retorted. "Now I shall have to pitch in a stiff demi-official asking how that young fiend came to be taken on in the NCD without examination. And I must do it before the NCD complain that I've been interfering with their departmental transfers. Aren't they human?" If you want to go back to the gate, I think our shortest way will be through here and across the war sheds. They came out of a side door into heaven's full light. A phalanx of shining ones swung across a great square singing, "To him who made the heavens abide, yet cease not from their motion, to him who drives the cleansing tide twice a day round ocean, let his name be magnified in all poor folks' devotion." Death halted their leader and asked a question. "We're volunteer aids serving powers," the seraph explained, "reporting for duty in the domestic-induced casualty department, told off to help relatives where we can." The shift trooped on. Such an array of powers, honours, glories, toils, patiences, services, faiths, and loves as no man may conceive even by favour of dreams. Death and St. Peter followed them into a DICD shed on the English side, where for the moment work had slackened. Suddenly, a name flashed on the telephone indicator. "Mrs. Arthur Bendot, 317 Portsmouth Avenue, Brondesbury. Husband badly wounded. One child. Her special weakness was appended." A seraph on the raised dais that overlooked the volunteer aides waiting at the entrance nodded and crooked a finger. One of the new shift, a temporary acting glory, hurled himself from his place and vanished earthward. "You may take it," Death whispered to St. Peter. "There will be a sustaining epic built up round Private Beddott's wound for his wife and baby Beddott to cling to. And here," they heard wings that flapped wearily, "here, I suspect, comes one of our failures." A seraph entered and dropped, panting on a form. His plumage was ragged, his sword splintered to the hilt, and his face still worked with the passions of the world he had left, as his soiled vesture reeked of alcohol. "Defeat," he reported hoarsely when he had given in a woman's name. "Utter defeat. Look." He held up the stump of his sword. "I broke this on her gin bottle." "So, we try again," said the impassive chief seraph. Again he beckoned, and there stepped forward that very imp whom Death had transferred from the NCD. "Go you," said the seraph. "We must deal with a fool according to her folly. Have you pride enough?" There was no need to ask. The messenger's face glowed, and his nostrils quivered with it. Scarcely pausing to salute, he poised and dived, and the papers on the desk spun beneath the draught of his furious fans. St. Peter nodded high approval. "I see," he said. "You'll work on her pride to steady her. By all means. If by all means, as my good Paul used to say. Only it ought to read by any manner of possible means. Excellent." "It's difficult, though," the soft-eyed Patience whispered. "I fail again and again. I'm only fit for an old maid's tea party." Once more the record flashed. A multiple urgent appeal on behalf of a few thousand men, worn out body and soul. The Patience was detailed. "Oh me," she sighed with a comic little shrug of despair, and took the void softly as a summer breeze at dawning. "But how does this come under the head of domestic casualties? Those men were in the trenches." "I heard the mud squelch," said St. Peter. "There was something wrong with the installation as usual. Waves are always jamming here," the seraph replied. "So it seems," said St. Peter as a wireless cut in with the muffled note of someone singing, sorely out of tune, to an accompaniment of desultory poppings. "Unless you can love as the angels love, with the breath of heaven be—" It broke off. The record showed a name. The waiting seraphs stiffened to attention with a click of tense quills. "As you were," said the chief seraph. "He's met her." "Who is she?" said St. Peter. "His mother. You never get over your weakness for romance, Death answered, and a covert smile spread throughout the office. Thank heaven I don't, but I really ought to be going. Wait 1 minute. There's trouble coming through, I think, Death interposed. The recorder had sparked furiously in a broken run of SOSs that allowed no time for inquiry. Name! Name! An impatient young Faith panted at last. It can't be blotted out. No name came up, only the reiterated appeal. False alarm, said a hard-featured toil, well used to mankind. Some fool has found out that he owns a soul. Wants work. I'd cure him. Hush, said Love in armour, stamping his mailed foot. The office listened. Bad case? Death demanded at last. Rank bad, sir. They're holding back the name, said the chief seraph. The SOS signals grew more desperate, and then ceased with an emphatic thump. The Love in armour winced. Firing party, he whispered to St. Peter. Can't mistake that noise. What is it? St. Peter cried nervously. Deserter, spy, murderer, was the chief seraph's weighed answer. It's out of my department now. No, hold the line. The name shone up at last. It showed for an instant, broken and faint as sparks on charred wadding, but in that instant a dozen pens had it written. St. Peter, with never a word, gathered his robes about him and bundled through the door headlong for the gate. No hurry, said Death at his elbow. With the present rush, your man won't come up for ever so long. Never can be sure these days. Anyhow, the lower establishment will be after him like sharks. He's the very type they'd want for propaganda. Deserter, traitor, murderer. Out of my way, please, babies. A group of children round a red-headed man who was telling them stories scattered laughing. The man turned to St. Peter. Deserter, traitor, murderer, he repeated. Can I be of service? You can, St. Peter gasped. Double on ahead to the gate and tell them to hold up all expulsions till I come. Then, he shouted as the man sped off at a long, hound-like trot, go and picket the outskirts of the convoys. Don't let anyone break away on any account. Quick! But Death was right. They need not have hurried. The crowd at the gate was far beyond the capacities of the examining board, even though, as St. Peter's deputy informed it, it had been enlarged twice in his absence. We're doing our best, the seraph explained, but delay is inevitable, sir. The lower establishment are taking advantage of it as usual, at the tail of the convoys. I've doubled all pickets there, and I'm sending more. Here's an extra list, sir. Ark J, Bradler C, Bunyan J, Calvin J, Iscariot J reported me just now, as under your orders, and took 'em with him. Also Shakespeare W, and never mind the rest, said St. Peter. I'm going there myself. Meantime, carry on with the passes. Don't fiddle over 'em and give me a blank or two. He caught up a thick block of free passes, nodded to a group in khaki at a passport table, initialed their commanding officer's personal pass as for officer and party, and left the numbers to be filled in by a quite competent-looking quartermaster sergeant. Then, Death beside him, he breasted his way out of the gate against the incoming multitude of all races, tongues and creeds that stretched far across the plain. An old lady, firmly clutching a mottle-nosed, middle-aged major by the belt, pushed across a procession of keen-faced poilus and blocked his path, her captive held in that terrible mother grip no power has yet been able to unlock. "I've found him! I've got him! Pass him!" St. Peter's jaw fell. Death politely looked elsewhere. "There are a few formalities," the saint began. "With Jerry in this state? Nonsense! How like a man! My boy never gave me a moment's anxiety and—" "Don't, dear, don't!" The Major looked almost as uncomfortable as St. Peter. "Well, nothing compared with what he would give me if he weren't passed." "Didn't I hear you singing just now?" Death asked, seeing that his companion needed a breathing space.
Of course you did, the mother intervened. He sings beautifully. That's another reason. You're bass, aren't you now, darling?
St. Peter glanced at the agonized Major and hastily initialed him a pass. Without a word of thanks, the mother hauled him away. Now under what conceivable ruling do you justify that?
I.W., the importunate widow. It's scandalous.
St. Peter groaned. Then his face darkened as he looked across the great plain beyond the gate. I don't like this, he said. The lower establishment is out in full force tonight. I hope our pickets are strong enough. The crowd here had thinned to a disorderly queue, flanked on both sides by a multitude of busy, discreet emissaries from the lower establishment, who continually edged in to do business with them, only to be edged off again by a line of watchful pickets. Thanks to the khaki everywhere, the scene was not unlike that which one might have seen on earth any evening of the old days outside the refreshment room by the arch at Victoria Station, when the army train started. St. Peter's appearance was greeted by the usual outburst of cock-crowing from the lower establishment. Dirty work at the crossroads, said Death dryly. I deserve it, St. Peter grunted. But think what it must mean for Judas. He shouldered into the thick of the confusion where the pickets coaxed, threatened, implored, and in extreme cases bodily shoved the wearied men and women past the voluble and insinuating spirits who strove to draw them aside. A Shropshire yeoman had just been accepted, together with a forged pass, the assurance of a genial runner of the lower establishment that heaven lay around the corner, and was being stealthily steered thither, when a large hand jerked him back, another took the runner in the chest, and someone thundered, "Get out, you crimp!" The situation was then vividly explained to the soldier in the language of the barrack room.
Don't mind me, governor, the man expostulated. I haven't seen a woman, let alone angels, for umpteen months. I'm from Joppa. Where you from?
Northampton, was the answer. Rein back and keep by me.
What? You ain't ever Charlie B that my dad used to tell about? I thought you always said...
I shall say a deal more. Your sergeant's talking to that woman in red. Fetch him in, quick. Meantime, a sunken-eyed Scots officer, utterly lost to the riot around, was being buttonholed by a person of reverend aspect, who explained to him that by the logic of his own ancestral creed, not only was the Highlander irrevocably damned, but that his damnation had been predetermined before earth was made.
"It's unanswerable, just unanswerable," said the young man sorrowfully. "I'll be with ye."
He was moving off when a smallish figure interposed, not without dignity.
"Monsieur," it said, "would it be of any comfort to you to know that I was John Calvin?"
At this the Reverend One cursed and swore like the lost soul he was, while the Highlander turned to discuss with Calvin, pacing towards the gate, some alterations in the fabric of a work of fiction called the Institutio. Others were not so easily held. A certain woman with loosened hair, bare arms, flashing eyes, and dancing feet shepherded her knot of waverers, hoarse and exhausted. When the taunt broke out against her from the opposing line,
"Tell him what you were. Tell him if you dare,"
she answered unflinchingly. As did Judas, who, worming through the crowd like an Armenian carpet vendor, peddled his shame aloud that it might give strength to others. "Yes," he would cry, "I am everything they say. But if I am here, it must be a moral cert for you, gents. This way, please. Many mansions, gentlemen. Good billets. Don't you notice these low people, sir? Please keep hope, gentlemen." When there were cases that cried to him from the ground, poor souls who could not stick it but had found their way out with a rifle and a bootlace, he would tell them of his own end, till he made them contemptuous enough to rise up and curse him. Here St. Luke's imperturbable bedside manner backed and strengthened the other's almost too oriental flux of words. In this fashion, and step by step, all the day's convoy were piloted past that danger point, where the lower establishment are, for reasons not given us, allowed to ply their trade. The pickets dropped to the rear, relaxed, and compared notes. "What always impresses me most," said Death to St. Peter, "is the sheep-like simplicity of the intellectual mind." He'd been watching one of the pickets, apparently overwhelmed by the arguments of an advanced atheist who, so hot in his argument that he was deaf to the offers of the lower establishment to make him a god, and had stalked, talking hard, while the picket always gave ground before him, straight past the broad road. "He was platting of long-tagged epigrams," the sober-faced picket smiled. "Give that sort only an ear, and they'll follow ye gobbling like turkeys." "And John held his peace through it all," a full, fresh voice broke in. "If it may be so," says John. "Doubtless in your belief it is so," says John. "Your words move me mightily," says John, and gorges his own beliefs like a pike going backwards. And that young fool, so busy spinning words, that he trips past hell-mouth without seeing it. "Who's yonder, Joan?" "One of your English. Always late. Look." A young girl with short-cropped hair pointed with her sword across the plain to a single faltering figure who made at first as though to overtake the convoy, but then turned left towards the lower establishment, who were enthusiastically cheering him as a leader of enterprise. "That's my traitor," said St. Peter. "He has no business to report to the lower establishment before reporting to convoy." The figure's pace slackened as he neared the applauding line. He looked over his shoulder once or twice, and then fairly turned tail and fled again towards the still convoy. "Nobody ever gave me credit for anything I did," he began, sobbing and gesticulating. "They were all against me from the first. I only wanted a little encouragement. It was a regular conspiracy, but I showed them what I could do. I showed them, and... He halted again. "Oh, God, what are you going to do with me?" No one offered any suggestion. He ranged sideways like a doubtful dog, while across the plain the lower establishment murmured seductively. All eyes turned to St. Peter. "At this moment," said Peter half to himself, "I can't recall any precise ruling under which—" "My own case?" the ever-ready Judas suggested. "No, that's making too much of it, and yet—" "Oh, hurry up and get it over," the man wailed, and told them all that he had done, ending with the cry that none had ever recognized his merits, neither his own narrow-minded people as inefficient employers, nor the snobbish jumped-up officers of his battalion. "You see," said St. Peter at the end, "it's sheer vanity. It isn't even as if we had a woman to fall back upon." "If there was a woman, or I'm mistaken," said the picket with the pleasing voice who had praised John. "What? When?" St. Peter turned swiftly on the speaker. "Who was the woman?" "The wise woman at Tekoa," came the smooth answer. "I remember, because that verse was the private heart of my plays. Some of them." The saint was not listening. "You have it," he cried. "Samuel 2:14. To think I should have forgotten. For we needs must die, and are as water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Neither doth God respect any person, yet. Here you, listen to this." The man stepped forward and stood to attention. Someone took his cap as Judas and the picket, John, closed up beside him. "Yet doth he devise means," do you understand that? "Devise means that his banished be not expelled from him. This covers your case. I don't know what the means will be. That's for you to find out. They'll tell you yonder." He nodded towards the now silent lower establishment as he scribbled on a pass. "Take this paper over to them and report for duty there. You'll have a thin time of it, but they won't keep you a day longer than I've put down. Escort?" Does that mean there's any hope?" the man stammered. "Yes, I'll show you the way," Judas whispered. "I've lived there a very long time." "I'll bear you company apiece," said John on his left flank. "There'll be despair to deal with. Heart up, Mr. Little Soul. The three wheeled off, and the convoy watched them grow smaller and smaller across the plain. St. Peter smiled benignantly and rubbed his hands. "And now we're rested," said he, "I think we might make a push for billets this evening, gentlemen, eh?" The pickets fell in, guardians no longer, but friends and companions all down the line. There was a little burst of cheering, and the whole convoy strode away towards the not-so-distant gate. The saint and Death stayed behind to rest a while. It was a heavenly evening. They could hear the whistle of the low-flying cherubim, clear and sharp, under the diviner note of some released seraph's wings, where, his errand accomplished, he plunged 3 or 4 stars deep into the cool baths of Hercules, the steady dynamo-like hum of the nearer planets on their axes, and as the hush deepened, the surprised little sigh of some newborn sun, a universe of universes away. But their minds were with the convoy that their eyes followed. St. Peter, proudly at last, "If those people of mine had seen that fellow stripped of all hope in front of them, I doubt they could have marched another yard tonight. Watch them stepping out, though. Aren't they human?" "To whom do you say it?" Death answered with something of a tired smile. "I'm more than human. I've got to die some time or other, but all other created beings, afterwards—" "I know," said St. Peter softly. "That's why I love you, O Azrael." For now they were alone. Death had, of course, returned to his true majestic shape, that only one of all created beings who was doomed to perish utterly, and knows it. "Well, that's that for me," Death concluded as he rose. "And yet—" He glanced towards the empty plain where the lower establishment had withdrawn with their prisoner. "Yet doth he devise means." End of section 24.
Section 25 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narrator read by Larry Wilson.
Powers and Gifts.
Toils, read by
Glories, read by Alan Mapstone.
Services and Loves, read by Agnes Robert
Patiences, read by Jim Hedrick.
Hopes, read by Elsie
Faiths, read by Jenn Broda.
Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. The Supports. Song of the Waiting Seraphs. Full chorus.
To him who bade the heavens abide, yet cease not from their motion.
To him who tames the moonstruck tide twice a day round ocean.
Let his names be magnified in all poor folks' devotion.
Powers and Gifts.
Not for prophecies or powers, visions, gifts or graces, but the unregardful hours that grind us in our places, with the burden on our backs, the weather in our faces.
Toils.
Not for any miracle of easy loaves and fishes, but for doing 'gainst our will work against our wishes, such as finding food to fill daily emptied dishes.
Glories.
Not for voices, harps or wings, or rapt illumination, but the grosser self that springs of use and occupation, unto which the spirit clings as her last salvation.
Powers, glories, toils, and gifts.
He who launched our ship of fools many anchors gave us, lest one gale should start them all, one collision save us. Praise him for the petty creeds that prescribe in paltry needs solemn rites to trivial deeds, and by small things save us.
Services and Loves.
Heart may fail and strength outwear, and purpose turn to loathing, But the everyday affair of business, meals and clothing, build a bulkhead twixt despair and the edge of nothing.
Patiences.
Praise him then who orders it that, though earth be flaring, and the crazy skies are lit by the searchlights of the pit, man should not depart a whit from his wonted bearing.
Hopes.
He who bids the wild swan's host still maintain their flight on, air roads over islands lost, ages since 'neath ocean lost, beaches of some sunken coast their fathers would alight on.
Faiths.
He shall guide us through this dark, not by new-blown glories, but by every ancient mark our fathers used before us, till our children ground their ark where the proper shore is.
Services, patiences, faiths, hopes, and loves.
He who used the clay that clings on our boots to make us shall not suffer earthly things to remove or shake us. But when man denies his Lord, habit without fleet or sword, custom without threat or word, sees the ancient fames restored, the timeless rights o'ertake us.
Full chorus.
For he who makes the mountains smoke
and rives the hills asunder,
And tomorrow leads the grass, mere unconquerable grass,
Where the fuming crater was, to heal and hide it under,
he shall not
shall lay on us the yoke of too long fear and wonder.
End of section 25.
Section 26 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. Untimely. Nothing in life has been made by man for man's using, but it was shown long since to man in ages lost as the name of the maker of it, who received oppression and scorn for his wages, hate, avoidance, and scorn in his daily dealings, until he perished, wholly confounded. More to be pitied than he are the wise souls who foresaw the evil of losing knowledge or art before time, and aborted noble devices and deep-wrought healings, lest offence should arise. Heaven delivers on earth the hour that cannot be thwarted, neither advanced at the price of a world or a soul, and its profit comes through the blood of the vanguards who dreamed, too soon, it had sounded. End of section 26.
Section 27 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Noreen. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. Section 27. The Eye of Allah. The cantor of St. Elod's, being far too enthusiastic a musician to concern himself with its library, the sub-cantor, who idolized every detail of the work, was tidying up, after 2 hours writing and dictation in the scriptorium. The copying monks handed him in their sheets. It was a plain 4 Gospels ordered by an abbot at Evesham, and filed out to Vespers. John Otho, better known as John of Burgos, took no heed. He was burnishing a tiny boss of gold in his miniature of the Annunciation for his Gospel of St. Luke, which it was hoped that Cardinal Falcodi, the papal legate, might later be pleased to accept. "Break off, John," said the sub-cantor in an undertone. "Eh? Gone, have they? I never heard. Hold a minute, Clement." The sub-cantor waited patiently. He had known John more than a dozen years, coming and going at St. Ilod's, to which monastery John, when abroad, always said he belonged. The claim was gladly allowed for. More even than other Fitz authors, he seemed to carry all the arts under his hand, and most of their practical receipts under his hood. The sub-cantor looked over his shoulder at the pinned-down sheet, where the first words of the Magnificat were built up in gold, washed with red lac, for a background to the Virgin's hardly yet fired halo. She was shown, hands joined in wonder, at a lattice of infinitely intricate arabesque, round the edges of which sprays of orange bloom seemed to load the blue hot air that carried back over the minute parched landscape in the middle distance. "You've made her all Jewess," said the sub-cantor, studying the olive-flushed cheek and the eyes charged with foreknowledge. "What else was Our Lady?" John slipped out the pins. "Listen, Clement, if I do not come back, this goes into my great Luke, whoever finishes it." He slid the drawing between its guard papers. "Then you're for Burgos again, as I heard." "In 2 days. The new cathedral yonder, but they're slower than the wrath of God, those masons, is good for the soul." "Thy soul?" The sub-cantor seemed doubtful. "Even mine, by your permission. And down south, on the edge of the conquered countries, Granada way, there's some Moorish diaper work that's wholesome. It allays vain thought and draws it toward the picture, as you felt just now in my enunciation." It was very beautiful. No wonder you go. But you'll not forget your absolution, John." "Surely." This was a precaution John no more omitted on the eve of his travels than he did the recutting of the tonsure, which he had provided himself with in his youth, somewhere near Ghent. The mark gave him privilege of clergy at a pinch, and a certain consideration on the road always. "You'll not forget either what we need in the scriptorium. There's no more true ultramarine in this world now. They mix it with that German blue, and as for vermilion—" "I'll do my best always." "And Brother Thomas?" This was the infirmarian in charge of the monastery hospital. "He'll do his own asking. I'll go over his side now and get me retonsured." John went down the stairs to the lane that divides the hospital and cook-house from the back cloisters. While he was being barbered, Brother Thomas, St. Ilod's meek but deadly persistent infirmarian, gave him a list of drugs that he was to bring back from Spain, by hook, crook, or lawful purchase. Here they were surprised by the lame, dark Abbot Stephen, in his fur-lined night boots. Not that Stephen de Sautré was any spy, but as a young man he had shared an unlucky crusade, which had ended after a battle at Mansoura in 2 years' captivity among the Saracens at Cairo, where men learn to walk softly. A fair huntsman and hawker, a reasonable disciplinarian, but a man of science above all, and a doctor of medicine under one Ranulphus, canon of St. Paul's. His heart was more in the monastery's hospital work than its religious. He checked their list interestedly, adding items of his own. After the infirmarian had withdrawn, he gave John generous absolution to cover lapses by the way, for he did not hold with transport indulgences. "And what seek you this journey?" he demanded, sitting on the bench beside the mortar and scales in the little warm cell for stored drugs. "Devils mostly," said John, grinning. "In Spain? Are not Abana and Farfar?" John, to whom men were but matter for drawings, and well born to boot, since he was a de Sandford on his mother's side, looked the abbot full in the face, and "Did you find it so?" said he. "No, they were in Cairo too. But what's your special need of 'em?" "For my great Luke. He's the master-hand of all 4 when it comes to devils." "No wonder. He was a physician. You're not." "Heaven forbid! But I'm weary of our church-pattern devils. They're only apes and goats and poultry conjoined. Good enough for playing red and black hells and judgment days, but not for me." "What makes you so choice in them?" "Because it stands to reason and art that there are all musters of devils in hell's dealings. Those 7, for example, that were haled out of the Magdalene, they'd be she-devils. no kin at all to the beaked and horned and bearded devils general." The abbot laughed. "And see again, the devil that came out of the dumb man, what use is snout or bill to him? He'd be faceless as a leper. Above all, God send I live to do it, the devils that entered the Gadarene swine, they'd be, I know not yet what they'd be, but they'd be surpassing devils. I'd have 'em diverse as the saints themselves, but now they're all one pattern, for wall, window, or picture work. Go on, John, you're deeper in this mystery than I." "Heaven forbid! But I say there's respect due to devils, damned though they be." "Dangerous doctrine." "My meaning is that if the shape of anything be worth man's thought to picture to man, it's worth his best thought." "That's safer. But I'm glad I've given you absolution." "There's less risk for a craftsman who deals with the outside shapes of things for Mother Church's glory." "Maybe so. But John—" The abbot's hand almost touched John's sleeve. "Tell me now, is she Moorish or Hebrew?" "She's mine," John returned. "Is that enough?" "I have found it so." Well, it's out of my jurisdiction, but how do they look at it down yonder?" "Oh, they drive nothing to a head in Spain, neither church nor king bless them. There's too many Moors and Jews to kill them all, and if they chased 'em away, there'd be no trade nor farming. Trust me, in the conquered countries from Seville to Granada, we live lovingly enough together, Spaniard, Moor, and Jew. You see, we ask no questions." Yes, Stephen sighed, "and always there's the hope she may be converted." "Oh yes, there's always hope." The abbot went on into the hospital. It was an easy age before Rome tightened the screw as to clerical connections. If the lady were not too forward, or the son too much his father's beneficiary, in ecclesiastical preferments and levies, a good deal was overlooked. But, as the abbot had reason to recall, unions between Christian and infidel led to sorrow. None the less, when John with mule, mails, and man clattered off down the lane for Southampton and the sea, Stephen envied him. He was back 20 months later in good hard case, and loaded down with fairings, a lump of richest lazuli, a bar of orange-hearted vermilion, and a small packet of dried beetles, which make most glorious scarlet for the subcanter. Besides that, a few cubes of milky marble, with yet a pink flush in them, which could be slaked and ground down to incomparable background stuff. There were quite half the drugs that the abbot and Thomas had demanded, and there was a long, deep red cornelian necklace for the abbot's lady, Anne of Norton. She received it graciously, and asked where John had come by it. "Near Granada," he said. "You left all well there?" Anne asked. Maybe the abbot had told her something of John's confession. "I left all in the hands of God." "Ah me! How long since?" 4 months less 11 days. "Were you with her?" "In my arms. Childbed." "And?" "The boy too. There is nothing now." Anne of Norton caught her breath. "I think you'll be glad of that," she said after a while. "Give me time, and maybe I'll compass it, but not now." "You have your handwork and your art, and John, remember, there's no jealousy in the grave." "Yes, I have my art, and heaven knows I'm jealous of none." "Thank God for that at least," said Anne of Norton, the always ailing woman, who followed the abbot with her sunk eyes. "And be sure I shall treasure this," she touched the beads, "as long as I shall live." "I trusted it to you for that," he replied, and took leave. When she told the abbot how she had come by it, he said nothing, but as he and Thomas were storing the drugs that John handed over in the cell, which backs on to the hospital kitchen chimney, he observed of a cake of dried poppy juice. "This has power to cut off all pain from a man's body." "I have seen it," said John. "But for pain of the soul there is, outside God's grace, but one drug, and that is a man's craft, learning, or other helpful motion of his own mind." "That is coming to me too," was the answer. John spent the next fair May Day out in the woods with the monastery swineherd and all the porkers, and returned, loaded with flowers and sprays of spring, to his own carefully kept place in the north bay of the scriptorium. There, with his travelling sketch-books under his left elbow, he sunk himself past all recollections in his great Luke. Brother Martin, senior copyist, who spoke about once a fortnight, ventured to ask later how the work was going. "All here," John tapped his forehead with his pencil. "It has been only waiting these months to, be born. Are you free of your plain copying, Martin?" Brother Martin nodded. It was his pride that John of Burgos turned to him, in spite of his 70 years, for really good page work. "Then see." John laid out a new vellum, thin but flawless. "There's no better than this sheet from here to Paris. Yes, smell it if you choose. Wherefore, give me the compasses, and I'll set it out for you. If ye make one letter lighter or darker than its next, I'll stick ye like a pig." "Never, John!" The old man beamed happily. "But I will. Now follow. Here and here as I prick, and in script of just this height to the hair's breadth, ye'll scribe the 31st and 32nd verses of 8th Luke. Yes, the Gadarene swine! And they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss, and there was a herd of many swine." Brother Martin naturally knew all the Gospels by heart. "Just so, down to, and he suffered them. Take your time to it. My Magdalene has to come off my heart first." Brother Martin achieved the work so perfectly that John stole some soft sweetmeats from the abbot's kitchen for his reward. The old man ate them, then repented, then confessed, and insisted on penance, at which the abbot, knowing there was but one way to reach the real sinner, set him a book called De Virtutibus Herbarum to fair copy. St. Ilots had borrowed it from the gloomy Cistercians, who do not hold with pretty things, and the crab text kept Martin busy just when John wanted him for some rather specially spaced letterings. "See now," said the sub-cantor improvingly, "you should not do such things, John. Here's Brother Martin on penance for your sake." "No, for my great Luke. But I've paid the abbot's cook. I've drawn him till his own scullions cannot keep straight face. He'll not tell again." "Unkindly done. And you're out of favour with the abbot too. He's made no sign to you since you came back, never asked you to high table." "I've been busy. Having eyes in his head, Stephen knew it. Clement, there's no librarian from Durham to Torry fit to clean up after you." The sub-cantor stood on guard. He knew where John's compliments generally ended. "But outside the scriptorium, where I never go." The sub-cantor had been excused even digging in the garden, lest it should mar his wonderful book-binding hands. "In all things outside the scriptorium, you are the master fool of Christendom. Take it from me, Clement. I've met many." "I take everything from you." Clement smiled benignly. "You use me worse than a singing boy." They could hear one of that suffering breed in the cloister below, squalling as the cantor pulled his hair. "God love you, so I do. But have you ever thought how I lie and steal daily on my travels? Yes, and for aught you know, murder, to fetch you colours and earths." "True," said just and conscience-stricken Clement. "I have often thought that were I in the world, which God forbid, I might be a strong thief in some matters." Even Brother Martin, bent above his loathed De Virtutibus, laughed. But about midsummer, Thomas, the infirmarian, conveyed to John the abbot's invitation to supper in his house that night, with a request that he would bring with him anything that he had done for his great Luke. "What's toward?" said John, who had been wholly shut up in his work. "Only one of his wisdom dinners. You've sat at a few since you were a man." "True, and mostly good. How would Stephen have us?" "Gown and hood over all. There will be a doctor from Salerno, one Roger, an Italian, wise and famous with the knife on the body. He's been in the infirmary some 10 days, helping me, even me. Never heard the name, but our Stephen's physicus before Sacerdos always. And his lady has a sickness of some time. Roger came hither in chief because of her." "Did he? Now I think of it, I have not seen the Lady Anne for a while." "Ye've seen nothing for a long while. She has been housed near a month. They have to carry her abroad now." "So bad as that, then?" "Roger of Salerno will not yet say what he thinks, but—" "God pity Stephen. Who else at table beside thee?" "An Oxford friar. Roger is his name also. A learned and famous philosopher, and he holds his liquor too, valiantly. 3 doctors, counting Stephen. I've always found that means 2 atheists." Thomas looked uneasily down his nose. "That's a wicked proverb," he stammered. You should not use it." "Ho! Never come you the monk over me, Thomas. You've been infirmarian at St. Ilod's 11 years, and a lay brother still. Why have you never taken orders all this while?" I am not worthy." "10 times worthier than that new fat swine, Henry, who's his name, that takes the infirmary masses. He bullocks in with the viaticum under your nose, when a sick man's only faint from being bled. So the man dies, of pure fear. Ye know it. I've watched your face at such times. Take orders, Didymus. You'll have a little more medicine, and a little less mass with your sick then, and they'll live longer." "I am unworthy, unworthy," Thomas repeated pitifully. "Not you, but to your own master you stand or fall. And now that my work releases me for a while, I'll drink with any philosopher out of any school. And Thomas," he coaxed, "a hot bath for me in the infirmary before vespers." When the abbot's perfectly cooked and served meal had ended, and the deep-fringed naperies were removed, and the prior had sent in the keys with the word that all was fast in the monastery, and the keys had been duly returned with the word, "Make it so till prime," the abbot and his guests went out to cool themselves in an upper cloister that took them by way of the leads to the south choir side of the triforium. The summer sun was still strong, for it was barely 6 o'clock, but the abbey church, of course, lay in her wonted darkness. Lights were being lit for choir practice 30 feet below. "Our cantor gives them no rest," the abbot whispered. "Stand by this pillar, and we'll hear what he's driving them at now." "Remember all," the cantor's hard voice came up. "This is the soul of Bernard himself, attacking our evil world. Take it quicker than yesterday, and throw all your words clean bitten from you. In the loft there. Begin." The organ broke out for an instant, alone and dragily. Then the voices crashed together into that first fierce line of the De Contemptu Mundi. "Ora novissima, tempora pessima." A dead pause, till the assenting "Sunt" broke like a sob out of the darkness, and one boy's voice, clearer than silver trumpets, returned the long-drawn "Vigilemus." "Ecce minaciter, iminet arbiter." Organ and voices were leashed together in terror and warning, breaking away liquidly to the "Ille suprimus." Then the tone-colours shifted for the prelude to "Iminet, iminet, ut mala terminet." "Stop! Again!" cried the cantor, and gave his reasons a little more roundly than was natural at choir practice. "Ah, pity o' man's vanity! He's guessed we are here. Come away," said the abbot. Anne of Norton in her carried chair had been listening too, further along the dark triforium, with Roger of Salerno. John heard her sob. On the way back, he asked Thomas how her health stood. Before Thomas could reply, the sharp-featured Italian doctor pushed between them. "Following on our talk together, I judged it best to tell her," said he to Thomas. "What?" John asked simply enough. "What she knew already." Roger of Salerno launched into a Greek quotation to the effect that every woman knows all about everything. "I have no Greek," said John stiffly. Roger of Salerno had been giving them a good deal of it at dinner. "Then I'll come to you in Latin. Ovid hath it neatly. Utque malum late solet immedicabile cancer. But doubtless you know the rest, worthy sir." "Alas, my school Latin's but what I've gathered by the way from fools, professing to heal sick women. Hocus pocus. But doubtless you know the rest, worthy sir." Roger of Salerno was quite quiet till they regained the dining-room, where the fire had been comforted, and the dates, raisins, ginger, figs, and cinnamon-scented sweetmeats set out, with the choicer wines, on the after-table. The abbot seated himself, drew off his ring, dropped it, that all might hear the tinkle, into an empty silver cup, stretched his feet towards the hearth, and looked at the great gilt and carved rose in the barrel roof. The silence that keeps from Compline to Matins had closed on their world. The bull-necked friar watched a ray of sunlight split itself into colours on the rim of a crystal salt-cellar. Roger of Salerno had reopened some discussion with Brother Thomas on a type of spotted fever that was baffling them both in England and abroad. John took note of the keen profile and, it might serve as a note for the great Luke, his hand moved to his bosom. The abbot saw and nodded permission. John whipped out silver point and sketch-book. "Nay, modesty is good enough, but deliver your own opinion," the Italian was urging the infirmarian. Out of courtesy to the foreigner, nearly all the talk was in table Latin, more formal and more copious than monk's patter. Thomas began with his meek stammer. "I confess myself at a loss for the cause of the fever, unless, as Varro saith in his De Re Rustica, certain small animals which the eye cannot follow enter the body by the nose and mouth and set up grave diseases. On the other hand, this is not in Scripture." Roger of Salerno hunched head and shoulders like an angry cat. "Oh, is that?" he said, and John snatched down the twist of the thin lips. "Never at rest, John." The abbot smiled at the artist. "You should break off every 2 hours for prayers as we do. St. Benedict was no fool. 2 hours is all that a man can carry the edge of his eye or hand. For copyists, yes. Brother Martin is not sure after 1 hour. But when a man's work takes him, he must go on till it lets him go." "Yes, that is the demon of Socrates," the friar from Oxford rumbled above his cup. "The doctrine leans towards presumption," said the abbot. "Remember, shall mortal man be more just than his Maker?" "There is no danger of justice," the friar spoke bitterly, "but at least man might be suffered to go forward in his art or his thought. Yet if Mother Church sees or hears him move anyward, what says she? No, always no." "But if the little animals of Varro be invisible," this was Roger of Salerno to Thomas, "how are we any nearer to a cure?" "By experiment." The friar wheeled round on them suddenly. "By reason and experiment. The one is useless without the other. But Mother Church? Aye. Roger de Salerno dashed at the fresh bait like a pike. "Listen, sirs. Our bishops, our princes, strew our roads in Italy with carcasses that they make for their pleasure or wrath. Beautiful corpses. Yet if we doctors, so much as raise the skin of one of them to look at God's fabric beneath, what says Mother Church? Sacrilege! Stick to your pigs and dogs, or you burn." "And not Mother Church only," the friar chimed in. "Everywhere we are barred by the words of some man dead 1,000 years, which are held final. Who is any son of Adam, that his one say-so should close a door towards truth? I would not accept even Peter Peregrinus, my own great teacher." "Nor I Paul of Aegina," Roger Salerno cried. "Listen, sirs. Here is a case to the very point. Apuleius affirmeth, if a man eat fasting of the juice of the cut-leaved buttercup, sceleratus we call it, which means rascally," this with a condescending nod towards John, "his soul will leave his body laughing. Now this is the lie more dangerous than truth, since truth of a sort is in it." "He's away," whispered the abbot despairingly.
"For the juice of that herb, I know by experiment, burns, blisters, and wries the mouth. I know also the rictus, or pseudo-laughter, on the face of such as have perished by the strong poisons of herbs allied to this ranunculus. Certainly, that spasm resembles laughter. It seems, then, in my judgment, that Apuleius, having seen the body of one thus poisoned, went off at score and wrote that the man died laughing." "Neither staying to observe nor to confirm observation by experiment," added the friar, frowning.
Stephen, the abbot, cocked an eyebrow toward John.
"How think you?" said he.
"I'm no doctor," John returned, "but I'd say Apuleius, in all these years, might have been betrayed by his copyists. They take short-cuts to save themselves trouble. Put case that Apuleius wrote the so seems to leave the body laughing after this poison. There's not 3 copyists in 5, my judgment, would not leave out the seems to. For who'd question Apuleius? If it seemed so to him, so it must be, otherwise any child knows cut-leaved buttercup." "Have you knowledge of herbs?" Roger of Salerno asked curtly. "Only that when I was a boy in convent, I've made tetters round my mouth and on my neck with buttercup juice, to save going to prayer or cold nights." "Ah," said Roger, "I profess no knowledge of tricks." He turned aside stiffly. "No matter. Now for your own tricks, John," the tactful abbot broke in. "You shall show the doctors your Magdalene, and your Gadarene swine, and the devils." "Devils? Devils? I have produced devils by means of drugs, and have abolished them by the same means. Whether devils be external to mankind or immanent, I have not yet pronounced." Roger of Salerno was still angry. "Ye dare not," snapped the friar from Oxford. "Mother Church makes her own devils." "Not wholly. Our John has come back from Spain with brand new ones." Abbot Stephen took the vellum handed to him and laid it tenderly on the table. They gathered to look. The Magdalene was drawn in palest, almost transparent grisaille against a raging, swaying background of woman-faced devils. Each broke 2, and by her special sin, and each, one could see, frenziedly straining against the power that compelled her. "I've never seen the like of this grey shadow work," said the abbot. "How came you by it?" "Non nobis. It came to me," said John, not knowing he was a generation or so ahead of his time in the use of that medium. "Why is she so pale?" the friar demanded. "Evil has all come out of her. She'd take any colour now." "Aye, like light through glass. I see." Roger of Salerno was looking in silence, his nose nearer and nearer the page. "It is so," he pronounced finally. "Thus it is in epilepsy, mouth, eyes, and forehead.
even to the droop of her wrist there, every sign of it. She will need restoratives, that woman, and afterwards sleep natural. No poppy juice, or she will vomit on her waking, and thereafter, but I am not in my schools. He drew himself up. Sir, said he, you should be of our calling, for by the snakes of Aesculapius, you see. The two struck hands as equals. And how think you of the 7 devils? The abbot went on. These melted into convoluted flower or flame-like bodies, ranging in colour from phosphorescent green to the black-purple of outworn iniquity, whose hearts could be traced, beating through their substance, but, for sign of hope and the sane workings of life to be regained, the deep border was of conventionalized spring flowers and birds, all crowned by a kingfisher in haste, atilt through a clump of yellow iris. Roger of Salerno identified the herbs and spoke largely of their virtues. And now the Gadarene swine, said Stephen. John laid the picture on the table. Here were devils dishoused, in dread of being abolished to the void, huddling and hurtling together to force lodgment by every opening into the brute bodies offered. Some of the swine fought the invasion, foaming and jerking. Some were surrendering to it sleepily, as to a luxurious back-scratching. Others, wholly possessed, whirled off in bucking droves for the lake beneath. In one corner the freedman stretched out his limbs, all restored to his control, and our Lord, seated, looked at him, as questioning what he would make of his deliverance. "Devils indeed," was the friar's comment, "but wholly a new sort." Some devils were mere lumps, with lobes and protuberances, a hint of a fiend's face peering through jelly-like walls, and there was a family of impatient globular devlings, who had burst open the belly of their smirking parent, and were revolving desperately toward their prey. Others patterned themselves into rods, chains, and ladders, single or conjoined, round the throat and jaws of a shrieking sow, from whose ear emerged the lashing, glassy tail of a devil that had made good his refuge. And there were granulated and conglomerate devils, mixed up with the foam and slaver where the attack was fiercest. Thence the eye carried on to the insanely active backs of the downward racing swine, the swineherd's aghast face, and his dog's terror. Said Roger of Salerno, "I pronounce that these were begotten of drugs. They stand outside the rational mind." "Not these," said Thomas the infirmarian, who, as a servant of the monastery, should have asked his abbot's leave to speak. "Not these. Look, in the border." The border to the picture was a diaper of irregular but balanced compartments or cellules, where sat, swam, or weltered devils in blank, so to say, things as yet uninspired by evil, indifferent, but lawlessly outside imagination. Their shapes resembled, again, ladders, chains, scourges, diamonds, aborted buds, or gravid phosphorescent globes, some well-nigh star-like. Roger of Salerno compared them to the obsessions of a churchman's mind. "Malignant?" the friar from Oxford questioned. "Count everything unknown for horrible," Roger quoted with scorn. "Not I, but they are marvellous, marvellous. I think—" The friar drew back. Thomas edged in to see better, and half opened his mouth. "Speak," said Stephen, who had been watching him. "We are all in a sort doctors here." "I would say, then," Thomas rushed at it as one putting out his life's belief at the stake, "that these lower shapes in the borgia may not be so much hellish and malignant as models and patterns upon which John has tricked out and embellished his proper devils among the swine above there." "And what would that signify?" said Roger of Salerno sharply. "In my poor judgment, that he may have seen such shapes without help of drugs." "Now who, said John of Burgos, after a round and unregarded oath, "has made thee so wise of a sudden, my doubter?" "I wise? God forbid! Only, John, remember one winter 6 years ago, the snowflakes melting on your sleeve at the cook-house door. You showed me them through a little crystal that made things larger. Yes, the Moors call such an eyeglass the Eye of Allah, John confirmed. You showed me them melting, six-sided. You called them then your patterns. True. Snowflakes melt six-sided. I have used them for diaper work often. Melting snowflakes as seen through a glass, by art or optical? The friar asked. Art optical? I have never heard, Roger of Salerno cried. John, said the abbot of St. Ilods commandingly, was it? Is it so? In some sort, John replied. Thomas has the right of it. Those shapes in the borgia were my workshop patterns for the devils above. In my craft, Salerno, we dare not drug. It kills hand and eye. My shapes are to be seen honestly in nature. The abbot drew a bowl of rose water towards him. When I was prisoner with the Saracens after Mansoura, he began, turning up the fold of his long sleeve, there were certain magicians, physicians, who could show— he dipped his third finger delicately in the water— all the firmament of hell, as it were, in— he shook off one drop from his polished nail onto the polished table— even such a supernaculum as this. But it must be foul water, not clean, said John. Show us then. All, said Stephen. I would make sure, once more. The abbot's voice was official. John drew from his bosom a stamped leather box, some 6 or 8 inches long, wherein, bedded on faded velvet, lay what looked like silver-bound compasses of old boxwood, with a screw at the head which opened or closed the legs to minute fractions. The legs terminated not in points, but spoon-shapedly, one spatula pierced with a metal-lined hole less than 1/4 of an inch across, the other with a 1/2-inch hole. Into this latter John, after carefully wiping with a silk rag, slipped a metal cylinder that carried glass or crystal, it seemed, at each end. Ah, art optic, said the friar, but what is that beneath it? It was a small swivelling sheet of polished silver, no bigger than a florin, which caught the light and concentrated it on the lesser hole. John adjusted it without the friar's proffered help. And now to find a drop of water, said he, picking up a small brush. Come to my upper cloister. The sun is on the leads still, said the abbot, rising. They followed him there. Halfway along, a drip from a gutter had made a greenish puddle in a worn stone. Very carefully John dropped a drop of it into the smaller hole of the compass leg, and, steadying the apparatus on a coping, worked the screw in the compass joint, screwed the cylinder, and swung the swivel of the mirror till he was satisfied. Good. He peered through the thing. My shapes are all here. Now look, father. If they do not meet your eye at first, turn this nicked edge here, left or right-handed. I have not forgotten, said the abbot, taking his place. Yes, they are here, as they were in my time, my past time. There is no end to them. I was told there is no end. The light will go. Oh, let me look. Suffer me to see also, the friar pleaded, almost shouldering Stephen from the eyepiece. The abbot gave way. His eyes were on time past, but the friar, instead of looking, turned the apparatus in his capable hands. Nay, nay, John interrupted, for the man was already fiddling at the screws. Let the doctor see. Roger of Salerno looked, minute after minute. John saw his blue-veined cheekbones turn white. He stepped back at last, as though stricken. It is a new world, a new world. O God, unjust. I am old. And now, Thomas, Stephen ordered. John manipulated the tube for the infirmarian, whose hands shook, and he too looked long. It is life, he said presently, in a breaking voice. No hell, life created and rejoicing. The work of the Creator. They live, even as I have dreamed. Then it was no sin for me to dream. No sin. Oh God, no sin. He flung himself on his knees and began hysterically, the Benedicite omnia opera. And now I will see how it is actuated, said the friar from Oxford, thrusting forward again. Bring it within. The place is all eyes and ears, said Stephen. They walked quietly back along the leads. 3 English counties laid out in evening sunshine around them. Church upon church, monastery upon monastery, cell after cell, and the bulk of a vast cathedral moored on the edge of the banked shoals of sunset. When they were at the after-table once more, they sat down, all except the friar, who went to the window and huddled bat-like over the thing. I see, he was repeating to himself. He'll not hurt it, said John. But the abbot, staring in front of him, like Roger of Salerno, did not hear. The infirmarian's head was on the table between his shaking arms. John reached for a cup of wine. It was shown to me, the abbot was speaking to himself, in Cairo, that man stands ever between 2 infinities, of greatness and littleness. Therefore there is no end, either to life or... And I stand on the edge of the grave, snarled Roger of Salerno. Who pities me? Hush, said Thomas the infirmarian. The little creatures shall be sanctified to the service of his sick. What need? John of Burgos wiped his lips. It shows no more than the shapes of things. It gives good pictures. I had it at Granada. It was brought from the East, they told me. Roger of Salerno laughed with an old man's malice. What of Mother Church? Most holy Mother Church! If it comes to her ears that we have spied into her hell without her leave, where do we stand? At the stake, said the abbot of St. Elod's, and raising his voice a trifle, You hear that, Roger Bacon? Heard you that? The friar turned from the window, clutching the compasses tighter. No, he appealed. Not with Falcody, not with our English-hearted folks made Pope. He is wise, he is learned, he reads what I have put forth. Folks would never suffer it. Holy Pope is one thing, Holy Church another, Roger quoted. But I can bear witness. It is no art magic, the friar went on. Nothing is it except art optical, wisdom after trial and experiment, mark you. I can prove it, and my name weighs with men who dare think. Find them, croaked Roger of Salerno. 5 or 6 in all the world. That makes less than £50 by weight of ashes at the stake. I have watched such men, reduced. I will not give this up. The friar's voice cracked in passion and despair. It would be to sin against the light. No. Let us sanctify the little animals of Pharaoh, said Thomas. Stephen leaned forward, fished his ring out of the cup, and slipped it on his finger. My sons, said he, we have seen what we have seen. That it is no magic but simple art, the friar persisted, avails nothing. In the eyes of Mother Church, we have seen more than is permitted to man. But it was life, created and rejoicing, said Thomas. To look into hell, as we shall be judged, as we shall be proved to have looked, is for priests only, or green-sick virgins on the road to sainthood who, for cause any midwife could give you. The abbot's half-lifted hand checked Roger of Salerno's outpouring. Nor may even priests see more in hell than church knows to be there. John, there is respect due to church, as well as to devils. My trade's the outside of things, said John quietly. I have my patterns. But you may need to look again for more, the friar said. In my craft, a thing done is done with. We go on to new shapes after that. And if we trespass beyond bounds, even in thought, we lie open to the judgment of the church, the abbot continued. But thou knowest, Roger of Salerno had returned to the attack. Here's all the world in darkness concerning the causes of things, from the fever across the lane to thine own lady's eating malady. Think, I have thought upon it, Salerno. I have thought indeed. Thomas the infirmarian lifted his head again, and this time he did not stammer at all. As in the water, so in the blood must they rage and war with each other. I have dreamed these 10 years. I thought it was a sin, but my dreams and vows are true. Think on it again. Here's the light under our very hand. Quench it. You'd no more stand to roasting than any other. I'll give you the case as church, as I myself would frame it. Our John here returns from the moors, and shows us a hell of devils contending in the compass of 1 drop of water. Magic past clearance. You can hear the faggots crackle. But thou knowest, thou hast seen it all before, for man's poor sake, for old friendship's sake, Stephen. The friar was trying to stuff the compasses into his bosom as he appealed. What Stephen de Sautrey knows, you, his friends, know also. I would have you. Now, obey the abbot of St. Elod's. Give to me. He held out his ringed hand. May John here not even make a drawing of one screw, said the broken friar in spite of himself. Nowise. Stephen took it over. Your dagger, John, sheathed will serve. He unscrewed the metal cylinder, laid it on the table, and with the dagger's hilt smashed some crystal to sparkling dust, which he swept into a scooped hand and cast behind the hearth. It would seem, said he, the choice lies between 2 sins, to deny the world a light which is under our hand, or to enlighten the world before her time. What you have seen, I saw long since among the physicians at Cairo, and I know what doctrine they drew from it. Hast thou dreamed, Thomas? I also, with fuller knowledge. But this birth, my sons, is untimely. It will be but the mother of more death, more torture, more division, and greater darkness in this dark age. Therefore, I, who know both my world and the church, take this choice on my conscience. Go! It is finished. He thrust the wooden part of the compasses deep among the beech logs, till all was burned. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. The Last Ode, November 27, BC 8. Horace, Ode 31, Book 5. As watchers couched beneath a bantine oak, hearing the dawn wind stir, know that the present strength of night is broke, though no dawn threatened her, till dawn's appointed hour. So Virgil died, aware of change at hand, and prophesied change upon all the internal gods had made, and on the gods alike, fated as dawn, but as the dawn delayed till the just hour should strike. A star new risen above the living and dead, and the lost shades that were our loves restored, as lovers and forever. So he said, having received the word. Maecenas waits me on the Esquiline, thither tonight go I, and shall this dawn restore us, Virgil mine? To dawn beneath what sky? End of section 28. Section 29 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. The Gardener. One grave to me was given, one watch till judgment day, and God looked down from heaven and rolled the stone away. One day in all the years, 1 hour in that one day, his angel saw my tears and rolled the stone away. Everyone in the village knew that Helen Tyrrell did her duty by all her world, and by none more honourably than by her only brother's unfortunate child. The village knew, too, that George Tyrrell had tried his family severely since early youth, and were not surprised to be told that, after many fresh starts given and thrown away, he, an inspector of Indian police, had entangled himself with the daughter of a retired non-commissioned officer, and had died of a fall from a horse a few weeks before his child was born. Mercifully, George's father and mother were both dead, and though Helen, 35 and independent, might well have washed her hands of the whole disgraceful affair, she most notably took charge, though she was at the time under threat of lung trouble, which had driven her to the south of France. She arranged for the passage of the child, and a nurse from Bombay met them at Marseilles, nursed the baby through an attack of infantile dysentery due to the carelessness of the nurse, whom she had had to dismiss, and at last, thin and worn, but triumphant, brought the boy late in the autumn, wholly restored, to her Hampshire home. All these details were public property, for Helen was as open as the day, and held that scandals are only increased by hushing them up. She admitted that George had always been rather a black sheep, but things might have been much worse if the mother had insisted on her right to keep the boy. Luckily, it seemed that people of that class would do almost anything for money, and, as George had always turned to her in his scrapes, she felt herself justified. Her friends agreed with her in cutting the whole non-commissioned officer connection and giving the child every advantage. A christening by the rector under the name of Michael was the first step. So far as she knew herself, she was not, she said, a child lover, but for all his faults she had been very fond of George, and she pointed out that little Michael had his father's mouth to a line, which made something to build upon. As a matter of fact, it was the Tyrrell forehead, broad, low, and well-shaped, with the widely spaced eyes beneath it, that Michael had most faithfully reproduced. His mouth was somewhat better cut than the family type. But Helen, who would concede nothing good to his mother's side, vowed he was a Tyrrell all over, and, there being no one to contradict, the likeness was established. In a few years, Michael took his place, as accepted as Helen had always been, fearless, philosophical, and fairly good-looking. At 6, he wished to know why he would not call her Mummy, as other boys called their mothers. She explained that she was only his auntie, and that aunties were not quite the same as mummies, but that if it gave him pleasure, he might call her Mummy at bedtime, for a pet name between themselves. Michael kept his secret most loyally, but Helen, as usual, explained the fact to her friends, which, when Michael heard, he raged. "Why did you tell? Why did you tell? came at the end of the storm. "Because it's always best to tell the truth," Helen answered, her arm round him as he shook in his cot. "All right, but when the truth's ugly, I don't think it's nice. Don't you, dear?" "No, I don't. And," she felt the small body stiffen, "now you've told, I won't call you Mummy any more, not even at bedtimes." "But isn't that rather unkind?" said Helen softly. "I don't care. I don't care. You hurted me in my insides, and I'll hurt you back. I'll hurt you as long as I live." Don't talk like that, dear. You don't know what—" "I will, and when I'm dead, I'll hurt you worse." "Thank goodness, I shall be dead long before you, darling." "Ha!" Emma says. "Never know your luck." Michael had been talking to Helen's elderly, flat-faced maid. "Lots of little boys die quite soon. So'll I. Then you'll see." Helen caught her breath and moved towards the door. But the wail of "Mummy! Mummy!" drew her back again, and the two wept together. At 10 years old, after 2 terms at a prep school, something or somebody gave him the idea that his civil status was not quite regular. He attacked Helen on the subject, breaking down her stammered defences with the family directness. "Don't believe a word of it," he said cheerily at the end. "People wouldn't have talked like they did if my people had been married. But don't you bother, Auntie. I found out all about my sort in English history and the Shakespeare's bits. There was William the Conqueror to begin with, and heaps more, and they all got on first rate. 'Twon't make any difference to you, my being that, will it?" "As if anything could," she began. "All right, we won't talk about it any more if it makes you cry." He never mentioned the thing again of his own will, but when, 2 years later, he skillfully managed to have measles in the holidays, as his temperature went up to the appointed 104, he muttered of nothing else, till Helen's voice, piercing at last his delirium, reached him with assurance that nothing on earth or beyond could make any difference between them. The terms at his public school and the wonderful Christmas, Easter and summer holidays followed each other, variegated and glorious as jewels on a string. And as jewels, Helen treasured them. In due time, Michael developed his own interests, which ran their courses and gave way to others. But his interest in Helen was constant and increasing throughout. She repaid it with all that she had of affection or could command of counsel and money. And since Michael was no fool, the war took him just before what was like to have been a most promising career. He was to have gone up to Oxford with a scholarship in October. At the end of August, he was on the edge of joining the first holocaust of public school boys who threw themselves into the line. But the captain of his OTC, where he had been sergeant for nearly a year, headed him off and steered him directly to a commission in a battalion so new that half of it still wore the old army red, and the other half of it was breeding meningitis through living overcrowdedly in damp tents. Helen had been shocked at the idea of direct enlistment. "But it's in the family," Michael laughed. "You don't mean to tell me that you believed that old story all this time?" said Helen. Emma, his maid, had been dead now several years. "I gave you my word of honour, and I give it again, that it's all right. it is indeed. Oh, that doesn't worry me. It never did, he replied valiantly. What I meant was, I should have got into the show earlier if I had enlisted, like my grandfather. Don't talk like that. Are you afraid of its ending so soon, then? No such luck. You know what Kay says. Yes, but my banker told me last Monday it couldn't possibly last beyond Christmas for financial reasons. Hope he's right, but our colonel, and he's a regular, says it's going to be a long job. Michael's battalion was fortunate in that, by some chance, which meant several leaves, it was used for coast defence among shallow trenches on the North Fork coast, thence sent north to watch the mouth of a Scotch estuary, and lastly held for weeks on a baseless rumour of distant service. But the very day that Michael was to have met Helen for 4 whole hours at a railway junction up the line, it was hurled out to help make good the wastage of Lewes, and he had only just time to send her a wire of farewell. In France, luck again helped the battalion. It was put down near the salient, where it had led a meritorious and unexacting life, while the Somme was being manufactured, and enjoyed the peace of the Armentières and Levantine sectors when that battle began. Finding that it had sound views on protecting its own flanks and could dig, a prudent commander stole it out of his own division under pretence of helping to lay telegraphs, and used it round Ypres at large. A month later, and just after Michael had written Helen that there was nothing special doing and therefore no need to worry, a shell splinter dropping out of a wet dawn killed him at once. The next shell uprooted and laid down over the body what had been the foundation of a barn wall, so neatly that none but an expert would have guessed that anything unpleasant had happened. By this time the village was old, in experience of war, and English fashion had evolved a ritual to meet it. When the postmistress handed her 7-year-old daughter the official telegram to take to Miss Tyrrell, she observed to the rector's gardener, "It's Miss Helen's turn now." He replied, thinking of his own son, "Well, he's lasted longer than some." The child herself came to the front door weeping aloud, because Master Michael had often given her sweets. Helen presently found herself pulling down the house blinds, one after one with great care, and saying earnestly to each, "Missing always means dead." Then she took her place in the dreary procession that was impelled to go through an inevitable series of unprofitable emotions. The rector, of course, preached hope and prophesied word very soon from a prison camp. Several friends, too, told her perfectly truthful tales, but always about other women to whom, after months and months of silence, the missing had been miraculously restored. Other people urged her to communicate with infallible secretaries of organisations who could communicate with benevolent neutrals, who could extract accurate information from the most secretive of Hun prison commandants. Helen did and wrote and signed everything that was suggested or put before her. Once, on one of Michael's leaves, he had taken her over a munition factory, where she saw the progress of a shell from blank iron to the all but finished article. "It's It struck her at the time that the wretched thing was never left alone for a single second, and "I'm being manufactured into a bereaved next of kin," she told herself, as she prepared her documents. In due course, when all the organisations had deeply or sincerely regretted their inability to trace, etc., something gave way within her, and all sensation, save of thankfulness for the release, came to an end in blessed passivity. Michael had died, and her world had stood still, and she had been one with the full shock of that arrest. Now she was standing still, and the world was going forward, but it did not concern her. In no way or relation did it touch her. She knew this by the ease with which she could slip Michael's name into talks and incline her head to the proper angle, at the proper murmur of sympathy. In the blessed realization of that relief, the armistice, with all its bells, broke over her and passed unheeded. At the end of another year she had overcome her physical loathing of the living and returned young, so that she could take them by the hand and almost sincerely wish them well. She had no interest in any aftermath, national or personal, of the war, but, moving at an immense distance, she sat on various relief committees and held strong views. She heard herself delivering them about the site of the proposed village war memorial. Then there came to her, as next of kin, an official intimation, backed by a page of a letter to her in indelible pencil, a silver identity disc, and a watch to the effect that the body of Lieutenant Michael Tyrrell had been found, identified, and reinterred in Hagensiel 3rd Military Cemetery. The letter of the row and the grave's number in that row duly given. So Helen found herself moved on to another process of the manufacture, to a world full of exultant or broken relatives, now strong in the certainty that there was an altar upon earth where they might lay their love. These soon told her, and by means of timetables made clear, how easy it was and how little it interfered with life's affairs to go and see one's grave. So different, as the rector's wife said, if he'd been killed in Mesopotamia or even Gallipoli. The agony of being waked up to some sort of second life drove Helen across the Channel, where, in a new world of abbreviated titles, she learned that Hagensiel 3rd could be comfortably reached by an afternoon train which fitted in with the morning boat, and that there was a comfortable little hotel not 3 kilometres from Hagensiel itself, where one could spend quite a comfortable night and see one's grave next morning. All this she had from a central authority who lived in a board and tar paper shed on the skirts of a raised city full of whirling lime dust and blown papers. "By the way," said he, "you know your grave, of course?" "Yes, thank you," said Helen, and showed its row and number typed on Michael's own little typewriter. The officer would have checked it out of one of his many books, but a large Lancashire woman thrust her between them and bade him tell her where she might find her son, who had been corporal in the ASC. His proper name, she sobbed, was Anderson, but, coming of respectable folk, he had of course enlisted under the name of Smith, and had been killed at Dickey Bush in early 15. She had not his number, nor did she know which of his 2 Christian names he might have used with his alias. But her cook's tourist ticket expired at the end of Easter week, and if by then she would not find her child, she should go mad. Whereupon she fell forward on Helen's breast. But the officer's wife came out quickly from a little bedroom behind the office, and the 3 of them lifted the woman onto the cot. "They are often like this," said the officer's wife, loosening the tight bonnet strings. Yesterday she said he'd been killed at Hooge. Are you sure you know your grave? It makes such a difference. Yes, thank you, said Helen, and hurried out before the woman on the bed should begin to lament again. Tea in a crowded mauve and blue striped wooden structure with a false front carried her still further into the nightmare. She paid her bill beside a stolid, plain-featured Englishwoman, who, hearing her inquire about the train to Hagensill, volunteered to come with her. I'm going to Hagensill myself, she explained. Not to Hagensill 3rd, mine is sugar factory, but they call it La Rosière now. It's just south of Hagensill 3. Have you got your room at the hotel there? Oh, yes, thank you, I wired. That's better. Sometimes the place is quite full, and at others there's hardly a soul, but they've put bathrooms into the old Lion d'Or. That's the hotel on the west side of the sugar factory, and it draws off a lot of people, luckily. It's all new to me. This is the first time I've been over. Indeed, this is my 9th time since the armistice. Not on my own account. I haven't lost anyone, thank God. But, like everyone else, I've a lot of friends at home who have. Coming over as often as I do, I find it helps them to have someone just look at the place and tell them about it afterwards. And one can take photos of them too. I get quite a list of commissions to execute. She laughed nervously and tapped her slung Kodak. There are 2 or 3 to see at Sugar Factory this time, and plenty of others in the cemeteries all about. My system is to save them up and arrange them, you know. And when I've got enough commissions for one area to make it worthwhile, I'll pop over and execute them. It does comfort people. I suppose so, Helen answered, shivering as they entered the little train. Of course it does. Isn't it lucky we've got window seats? It might do, or they wouldn't ask one to do it, would they? I've a list of quite 12 or 15 commissions here. She tapped the Kodak again. I must sort them out tonight. Oh, I forgot to ask you. What's yours? My nephew, said Helen, but I was very fond of him. Yes. I sometimes wonder whether they know after death. What do you think? Oh, I don't. I haven't dared to think much about that sort of thing, said Helen, almost lifting her hands to keep her off. Perhaps that's better, the woman answered. The sense of loss must be enough, I expect. Well, I won't worry you any more. Helen was grateful, but when they reached the hotel, Mrs. Garthworth, they had exchanged names, insisted on dining at the same table with her, and after the meal, in the little hideous salon full of low-voiced relatives, took Helen through her commissions, with biographies of the dead, where she happened to know them, and the sketches of their next of kin. Helen endured till nearly 9:30, ere she fled to her room. Almost at once there was a knock at her door, and Mrs. Garthworth entered, her hands holding the dreadful list clasped before her. Yes, I know, she began. You're sick of me, but I want to tell you something. You weren't married, are you? Then perhaps you won't. But it doesn't matter. I've got to tell someone. I can't go on any longer like this. But, please, Mrs. Garthworth had backed against the shut door, and her mouth worked dryly. In a minute, she said. You know about these graves of mine I was telling you about downstairs, just now. They really are commissions. At least several of them are. Her eye wandered round the room. What extraordinary wallpapers they have in Belgium, don't you think? Yes, I swear they are commissions. But there's one, do you see, and he was more to me than anything else in the world. Do you understand? Helen nodded. More than anyone else. And, of course, he ought not to have been. He ought to have been nothing to me. But he was. He is. That's why I do the commissions, you see. That's all. But why do you tell me? Helen asked desperately. Because I'm so tired of lying. Tired of lying. Always lying. Year in and year out. When I don't tell lies, I've got to act them. And I've got to think them. Always. Yes, don't know what that means. He was everything to me that he ought not to have been. The one real thing. The only thing that ever happened to me in all my life. And I've had to pretend he wasn't. I had to watch every word I said and think out what lie I'd tell next for years and years. How many years? Helen asked. 6 years and 4 months before, and 2 3/4 after. I've gone to him 8 times since. Tomorrow'll make the 9th, and I can't. I can't go to him again with nobody in the world knowing. I want to be honest with someone before I go. Do you understand? It doesn't matter about me. I was never truthful, even as a girl. But it isn't worthy of him. So I had to tell you. I can't keep it up any longer. Oh, I can't. She lifted her joined hands almost to the level of her mouth and brought them down sharply, still joined, to full arm's length below her waist. Helen reached forward, caught them, bowed her head over them, and murmured, "Oh, my dear, my dear." Mrs. Scarsworth stepped back, her face all mottled. "My God," she said, "is that how you take it?" Helen could not speak, and the woman went out, but it was a long while before Helen was able to sleep. Next morning, Mrs. Scarsworth left early on her round of commissions, and Helen walked alone to Hagenshill Third. The place was still in the making, and stood some 5 or 6 feet above the metalled road, which it flanked for hundreds of yards. Culverts across a deep ditch served for entrances through the unfinished boundary wall. She climbed a few wooden-faced earthen steps and then met the entire crowded level of the thing in one held breath. She did not know that Hagenshill Third counted 21,000 dead already. All she saw was a merciless sea of black crosses, bearing little stripes of stamped tin at all angles across their faces. She could distinguish no order or arrangement in their mass, nothing but waist-high wilderness as of weed-stricken dead, rushing at her. She went forward, moved to the left and the right hopelessly, wondering by what guidance she should ever come to her own. A great distance away there was a line of whiteness. It proved to be a block of some 200 or 300 graves whose headstones had already been set, whose flowers were planted out, and whose new-sown grass showed green. Here she could see clear-cut letters at the ends of the rows, and, referring to her slip, realized it was not where she must look. A man knelt behind a line of headstones, evidently a gardener, for he was firming a young plant in the soft earth. She went towards him, her paper in her hand. He rose at her approach, and without prelude or salutations asked, "Who are you looking for?" "Lieutenant Michael Tyrrell, my nephew," said Helen slowly and word for word, as she had many thousands of times in her life. The man lifted his eyes and looked at her with infinite compassion before he turned from the fresh-sown grass toward the naked black crosses. "Come with me," he said, "and I will show you where your son lies." When Helen left the cemetery, she turned for a last look. In the distance she saw the man bending over his young plants, and she went away, supposing him to be the gardener. End of section 29. Section 30 of Debits and Credits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling. The Burden. One grief on me is laid each day of every year, where no soul can aid, whereof no soul can hear, whereto no end is seen, except to grieve again. Ah, Mary Magdalene, where is there greater pain? To dream on dear disgrace each hour of every day, to bring no honest face to aught I do or say, to lie from morn till e'en, to know my lies are vain. Ah, Mary Magdalene, where can be greater pain? To watch my steadfast fear, attend my every way, each day of every year, each hour of every day, to burn and chill between, to quake and rage again. Ah, Mary Magdalene, where shall be greater pain? One grave to me was given, to guard till judgment day, but God looked down from heaven and rolled the stone away. One day of all my years, 1 hour of that one day, his angel saw my tears and rolled the stone away. End of section 30. End of Debits and Credits by Rudyard Kipling.